Chapter 219. On the day of the full moon, the sky brightened very late. It was probably because there were still thick dark clouds in the sky that had yet to disperse, and even the sun had yet to be seen. However, in the early morning, the rain that had been raining for an entire night gradually stopped, as if to give the world some time to breathe. Even the cold wind had disappeared. As the sky slowly brightened, the Kunlun mountain that had been immersed in the miserable wind and rain for an entire night seemed to slowly come back to life, and gradually became lively. The people in the mountain each did their own thing. After that, some of the Kunlun cultivators with higher status walked towards the direction of Tianquan Peak from all directions one after another. The annual sect council of the Kunlun party lasted for a day, and could basically be divided into two sessions, one big and one small. The big session started in the day, and was the grandest. The participants were almost all the elites of the Kunlun party, all the cultivators above the Jindan realm, and a small number of the most outstanding genius disciples in the foundational realm would participate. On the other hand, the small session was much smaller. It was held at night, and the participants were only the 10 or so Jinren of the Yuaning realm. Although there was a huge difference in the size of the big session and the small session, in terms of importance, it was actually the small session at night, where the discussion at the level of the Yuaning Jinren seemed to be more important. Perhaps because of this, during the big session during the day, there were not many Yuaning Jinren of the Yuaning Jinren who came to Tianquan Peak's Jingyang Hall. Those who could come, in fact, had tacitly expressed their support for Jinren of the idle month. Most people below the Yuaning Jinren of the Yuaning Jinren would not feel these subtle things that could only be understood, but the Kunlun party was so big, and there were also many elite cultivators. There were always some smart people who had sharp ears and eyes, and were experienced in the ways of the world, and could see some things. At this time, there were already many people in the majestic and spacious Jingyang Hall. At the same time, there were still people coming from outside the hall, making the solemn hall that symbolized the center of power of the Kunlun party become lively, which was rarely seen. Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca Japonica also came here. When they walked into the hall, many Jindan friar and foundational realm cultivators who passed by saluted to Dongfang Tao. This was a natural respect for the strong cultivators of the Yuaning realm. It should be known that among the countless cultivators in the world, those who could cultivate to the level of Yuaning Jinren might not even be 1 in 100,000, let alone 1 in 10,000. Dongfang Tao's expression was indifferent, and did not reveal any arrogance, nor did he reveal any overly gentle expression. In general he looked up. This was the expression that most Yuaning Jinren of the lower level. Yen Luo looked around and said with a smile, "It's indeed impressive. It's different now that you're a nascent soul-perfected cultivator." Dongfang Tao's expression did not change. His expression was still solemn, but he said in a low voice, "This is all because I am afraid of trouble. If I were to give those people a slightly better attitude, do you believe that there would be people who would immediately try to befriend me and ask for advice?" Melaleuca Japonica smiled. She did not refute his words. She probably knew what was going on in her heart. However, since this matter did not concern her, she could not be bothered to care. She only smiled and said, "In any case, it has nothing to do with me. I will follow you. This year, I will be able to get a good seat." Dongfang Tao smiled. His gaze turned and saw that most of the people were standing in the center of Jingyang Hall. However, the special small tables at the side of the hall were mostly empty. At a glance, there were only 2 or 3 people. As if sensing Dongfang Tao's gaze, those people also turned their heads and looked over. Both parties' gazes met in midair, after which they politely nodded to each other in greeting, and then turned their gazes away. Melaleuca Japonica's voice came from the side. This time, she also lowered her voice and said softly, "Not many people came." At this time, there were already many people standing in Jingyang Hall. Furthermore, there were still people coming in from outside the door. It showed that the Kunlun party was thriving. Of course, it could not be that not many people came. However, Dongfang Tao's expression did not change. He said, "It is still early. There should be more people by afternoon." Melaleuca Japonica looked at him and said, "I thought you would only come at night." Dongfang Tao was silent for a moment. Then he sighed and said, "You also understand these things in the sect. Those who came today during the day more or less have an explanation. At least, it can let the sect leader and the true monarch know my intentions." Melaleuca Japonica nodded and said, "You are right. It is just that I really thought that after you cultivated yuanying, you would be as honest as before and not stand out to express your stance." Dongfang Tao shook his head. A bitter smile flitted across the corner of his mouth. He said, "It is not that I did not think that way. But when I really reached my current position, only then did I realize that there are also difficulties. The number of yuanying zenrins is too few." As he said this, Dongfang Tao looked at the empty tables at the side and said softly, "In the past, I could hide and fight because there were many Jin Dan Friar zenrins. But there are only a dozen or so yuanying zenrins. It is clear who is right and who is wrong. Everyone is staring at you. You have no choice but to express your stance." Melaleuca Japonica sighed and said, "So, you chose the sect leader's side?" Dongfang Tao said, "If I don't choose senior brother Idle Month's side, what else can I choose? Am I really going to rely on senior brother Qiandeng and Mingzhu from Baichao Tang's side? The sect leader's faction is now the strongest in our sect. Senior brother Idle Month also has Hakushin Jinkuin backing him. Who can compete with him? Since I don't have any backing, if I want to find one, of course, I have to find the thickest thigh to cling to." Melaleuca Japonica shrugged and said, "You are right. If it were me, I would probably choose the same." Dongfang Tao smiled and glanced at the high and mighty main seat in the hall in the distance. He said, "Just watch. There will definitely be a lot of yuanying zenrins coming today. I heard that Uncle Master Bai Chun might be coming today." Yen Luo was taken aback. She said in a low voice, "Didn't he say that he was going to cultivate in peace last year and would no longer participate in the sect review meeting?" Dongfang Tao smiled without saying a word. Melaleuca Japonica quickly reacted and shook her head with a wry smile. Then, as if she suddenly thought of something, she said to Dongfang Tao, "But I haven't seen that person from the Heavenly Soldier Hall today. That's a little strange." Dongfang Tao thought for a moment and nodded. "Well, now that you mention it, I also feel it. Senior brother Dukong has always been a strong supporter of senior brother Idle Month. He has always been the first to come in the past. I didn't expect him to be late today. But he will definitely come. It's probably because something urgent happened at the Heavenly Soldier Hall." Melaleuca Japonica grunted in acknowledgement. Clearly, she didn't pay much attention to the matter. Instead, her eyes suddenly lit up. She saw a beautiful and outstanding woman walking in from the entrance of Jianghu Hall. It was Su Qingjun. From afar, Su Qingjun seemed to see them. She immediately smiled, waved at the two, and bowed slightly. Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca Japonica both smiled and nodded. Melaleuca Japonica said with some emotion, "This young lady is really not bad. It would be great if I could accept such a disciple in the future." Dongfang Tao chuckled and didn't say anything. In the Heavenly Soldier Hall, Dukan Jinren was dressed neatly. He looked radiant and in high spirits. His bearing was very dignified and awe-inspiring. As for he accompanied him all the way out. According to the results of yesterday's discussion, after Dukan Jinren left the Heavenly Soldier Hall, he did not immediately head to Tian Kuan Peak Xingyang Hall. Instead, he turned and walked towards the direction of the house where He Changxing died. Anyway, although the big meeting during the day was very grand and enthusiastic, the importance was not as important as the small meeting at night. What was more important was that there was a chance to catch the evil faction spy, which was a great merit. Dukan Jinren could even imagine, when he caught the evil faction spy and threw him in front of sect head senior brother, Idle Month senior brother would be surprised and pleasantly surprised. And from this, there was no need to say how highly Idle Month senior brother would regard him. The person that others couldn't catch, Dukan Jinren had done it and caught him. Wasn't this enough to explain the problem? Dukan Jinren was in a good mood and his footsteps were not slow. And he had been following his master all the way to that abandoned house. Then according to the clues left behind, the meeting place with the evil faction spy should be in the nearby vast mountain forest. At this time, the surroundings were very quiet, there was no one walking around. There were quite a number of odd job disciples living in this place, but they had nothing to do with the grand sect meeting that was currently being held. In fact, most of the odd job disciples had gone to work as usual. Dukhan Jinren didn't mind at all and soon strode towards that stretch of forest. He watched his master's back figure. A trace of complicated expression flashed past his eyes, but very quickly he still followed closely. Just that when both of them walked to the edge of that stretch of forest and were about to enter, Dukhan Jinren suddenly frowned and stopped his footsteps. He was stunned for a moment and said, "Master, what's wrong?" Dukhan Jinren muttered to himself, I suddenly thought of something. This evil faction spy matter is not a small matter. By right, before I make a move, I still have to inform sect head senior brother, at least after a discussion, get his permission before making a move." Speaking, Dukhan Jinren turned around and looked like he was about to leave. He was taken aback and hurriedly stopped him, said, "Master, where are you going?" Dukhan Jinren said, "I am going to Tianquan Peak to discuss with Idle Month's senior brother. In case he has other plans and temporarily doesn't want to catch the spy, wouldn't I be beating the grass and alerting the snake by going in this time?" Speaking, he smiled and said to he, "Xiao Yi, we have to consider everything thoroughly before doing things. We must not be rash. Let's go see Idle Month's senior brother first." He was stunned when he saw Dukhan Jinren turned and walked away. His face suddenly turned pale, even a layer of cold sweat faintly appeared on his forehead. Chapter 220. Teacher, hold on. He suddenly called out. Dukhan Jinren halted his steps, turned back and looked at Yi, said, "What is it?" Yi's mind turned rapidly, his eyes flickered slightly, his mouth instead said, "Disciple thinks we still have to continue to the forest to capture that evil faction spy." Dukhan Jinren frowned, for a moment pondered, although he had already decided to return to Tianquan Peak to discuss with Reverend Idle Month before taking action, but he was his proudest and most valued disciple. The weight of his words was naturally different from others, so for a moment he was somewhat hesitant. He took advantage of this rare moment, his eyes flashed and then suddenly took a step forward, stood beside Dukhan Jinren, lowered his voice and said, "Teacher, disciple thinks this matter is a great merit, but this merit should be personally received by you." Dukhan Jinren's eyes flashed, after a moment of silence, said, "What do you mean by that?" He took a deep breath and said, "After you capture the evil faction spy and detain him to Tianquan Peak, then the merit of eliminating the spy will be mostly credited to you. But if you first make a trip to Tianquan Peak, at that time, I'm afraid everyone will say that this matter was planned by sect head reverend who commanded the overall situation, and teacher, you are at most a hired thug. Do you think what I said makes sense?" Dukhan Jinren's eyes narrowed slightly. After a moment he said, "Me and Idle Month's senior brother are like brothers. All these years we have been supporting each other, this merit or not. Actually, it is not too important, right?" Yi's expression had already completely calmed down, heard the words and smiled, said to Dukhan Jinren, "Teacher, you have always been wise and farsighted. I don't believe that you have not thought of this. If you get the merit, it means that your ability is stronger. Idle Month Reverend should value you more. Other than that, I think." Speaking till here, Yi's voice suddenly lowered, softly said, "In this sect, between the clouds and the sky, isn't there still a deity realm true monarch? Teacher, we all know that is the real emperor. For you to do a good job in this matter, you will only be able to reach that perfected lord's ears if you obtain the greatest merit. Otherwise, if you were to inform perfected sect master first, I'm afraid perfected Lord Bai Chen will think that this matter was planned by Uncle Master Idle Moon and that you are just an ordinary fighter." Dukhan Jinren's heart suddenly palpitated, a yearning expression appeared on his face, but he seemed to still have some misgivings, looked at Yi and said in a low voice, "The real master of the Kunlun party now is Hakushin Jinkuan. I naturally know this in my heart. But no matter what, Idle Month is also the true monarch's personal disciple. There is a difference between close and distant. It is very difficult for me to surpass him, right?" Yi smiled and said, "Teacher, disciple did not purposely provoke the relationship between you and Reverend Idle Month. It is just that there is no need to inform him about this matter in advance. You did not do anything wrong at all. What's more, this matter was originally ordered by Reverend Idle Month. I found something and gave it to you, teacher. Isn't it also the right thing to do? Dukan Jinren pondered over and indeed felt that what he said was right, immediately clapped his hands, smiled and said, "What you said is indeed reasonable. My relationship with Idle Month's senior brother is naturally very good, but fighting for ourselves once in a while, it does not seem to be a bad thing." He smiled and said, "Isn't that so?" Dukan Jinren smiled and nodded, said, "Then let's do it this way, let's go in. The earlier we can catch that cunning and vicious evil sect spy, the earlier we can go back and meet Idle Month's senior brother." Saying that, he turned around and once again walked into the forest, while he, behind him, let out a long breath of turbid air, smiled bitterly, looked at Dukan Jinren's back figure with a complicated expression. A moment later, he also followed. Not long after, both of their figures disappeared into the forest. Flowing fragrance garden, tea room, guest room. Su Qingjun had already left this place. At the same time, because her brother Sumo had been unconscious after taking the antidote, it was not suitable for him to go out, so he was temporarily placed in the guest room. Exian also came here early in the morning. Because of the agreement with Su Qingjun yesterday, she would help look after Sumo today. Walking to the middle of the room, from afar, she saw Sumo lying unconscious on the bed. Exian took a look and felt that there was nothing serious, so she sat at the desk by the window, looking at the somewhat hazy sky outside. At this time, there seemed to be a slight breeze, some chill drifted in from the window, but Exian did not care much, only felt that it was somewhat deserted. Probably because those with some ability and reputation here had all gone to Tianquan Peak Shenyang Hall, there was not much of a figure in the corridor outside the window. Exian sighed softly, leaned on the table, and thought in her heart, why did this day pass so slowly? If only time could pass faster. By tomorrow, I can go find Lu Chen, and then go see Sister Su Qingjun together. Thinking of this, she could not help but smile again. Her mood became very good. Even the scene of the gathering dark clouds in the sky outside the room seemed a little brighter in her eyes. Between the clouds and the sky, on the winter peak. This morning, after White Lotus woke up, she felt a little uncomfortable in her heart, a little lazy, but she did not really want to stay in bed. Her mood became inexplicably strange and contradictory. White Lotus remembered that she did not have such strange feelings in the past, but in the recent 2 months, it would suddenly appear every 10 days to half a month. It was also strange. Could it be that this winter peak was too deserted, so my heart felt uncomfortable? But it could also be because of cultivating the ice and snow scripture. White Lotus always felt that ever since her master began to teach her this magical power, this strange feeling gradually appeared from nothing and gradually increased. But this feeling did not have any harm or other signs. Perhaps it was just a normal reaction to cultivating this peerless magical power? White Lotus was not very clear about the reason here. She thought in her heart whether she should find a chance to ask her master. After all, her 2 senior brothers did not cultivate this ice and snow scripture, so the only person who could explain her doubts was probably her master. It was just that during this period of time, Hakushin Jinkuin almost always cultivated in his snow-wind cave at the peak of the winter peak. He would not easily show up. Even his 3 disciples rarely saw him. Now that the sect meeting was imminent, the old man might come out, but he probably did not have time for White Lotus, so after thinking about it in her heart, White Lotus thought that she would probably have to wait for a while. After dawdling in the cave for a while, White Lotus still felt a little upset. She did not know what was wrong with her today, but she still felt a little uneasy. So in the end, she still walked out of the cave. The sky was full of wind and snow. Almost everywhere in sight was pure white. This was the unique scenery of the winter peak, one of the 4 magical peaks in the sky, almost every day of the year. White Lotus had lived on this winter peak for a while, but most of the time, she was still attracted by this strange and beautiful scenery, the coldness that belonged to the world of ice and snow. It was not something that most people in the world could see. She walked slowly along the mountain path, feeling a little hesitant, wondering if she should go down from the winter peak and go to the Flying Goose platform to look for Lu Chen again. That person and that black dog had some unspeakable secrets, and the one that White Lotus wanted to know the most was also one of those secrets, the secret of the blood food secret method. The sect meeting is such a high-class place. A useless servant disciple like him should not be able to go there, right? White Lotus thought to herself. Just as she was about to turn around and go down the mountain, White Lotus suddenly saw second senior brother Zhuxian standing on the mountain path in front of her. In the wind and snow, Zhuxian looked calm, his eyes were bright, and he was looking up at the sky. White Lotus followed his gaze and suddenly found that the sky was still gloomy, but second senior brother's eyes were fixed on the huge figure on the mountain peak. Second senior brother, why are you standing here? White Lotus called out to Zhuxian. Zhuxian was startled, and when he turned to see that it was White Lotus, a smile appeared on his face, and he said, It's little junior sister. White Lotus walked over, stood beside Zhuxian, and said, Senior brother, are you planning to welcome Master down? Actually, it's fine, Master should be coming down when the time comes. Zhuxian smiled slightly and said, It's fine, I have nothing to do anyway, I'll just treat it as waiting for Master to come down. White Lotus suddenly became curious and asked Zhuxian, Second senior brother, is the sect meeting fun? I haven't been there yet. Zhuxian lightly shook his head and said, It's not that interesting, those with low skills will flatter each other, and those with high skills will get rid of their dissenters. Finally, and also the most important, Yuanying old man will organize a night party, and only at that time will it be the real sect meeting. White Lotus smiled and said, Actually second senior brother, recently you've helped eldest senior brother, and really did a lot of things. Usually, you did the most of the various kinds of communication and organization arrangements, and instead, I think eldest senior brother doesn't seem to be as busy as you. Zhuxian laughed and said, What do you know, children shouldn't talk nonsense, or else if these words reach eldest senior brother's ears, then you'll be in trouble. White Lotus shrugged and greeted Zhuxian, only saying that it was windy here, and that when he went back to rest, she also walked back the way she came, but this time, she had already decided to go down the mountain and then find that man called Lu Qin. But at this time, suddenly, Zhuxian's voice came from behind and called out to her, Little junior sister. White Lotus turned around and asked, What's the matter, second senior brother? Zhuxian looked at her appearance, his gaze was very gentle, and after letting out a breath, she heard him say calmly, It's very cold here today. In a while, even Master and I will be leaving here. Why don't you go down the mountain by yourself? White Lotus was startled, and then looked at Zhuxian with a surprised expression, and said in surprise, You're telling me to go down the mountain by myself. Chapter 221. Go down the mountain to play. Zhuxian smiled and said, It's rare for you to have such free time. Otherwise, if Master and eldest senior brother were here, they would only ask you to go and practice. White Lotus was still a little surprised, but she was a little happy in her heart. Ever since she entered the Kunlun party, especially after she became a disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan, she spent most of her time on the high and mighty winter peak. Other than sneaking down in private, she did not have much contact with the ordinary people in the sect. Of course, the people she had the most contact with were the 3 people in Hakushin Jinkuan's sect. However, Hakushin Jinkuan was busy with practice, and Immortal Idol Month, as the sect leader of Kunlun, was busy with many affairs. The one who took care of her the most and met her the most was this second senior brother. In fact, White Lotus had a good impression of Zhuxian, but it was just a good impression. Although Zhuxian was a veteran Jindan friar in the Kunlun party, and his reputation was extremely high, he had a master and a senior brother who were too dazzling. Instead, Zhuxian seemed a little dim. For ordinary people and ordinary cultivators, the Jindan friar realm of 10 years was already the peak that they dreamed of. However, for Zhuxian, the world often changed their view. Your master is a peerless deity transformation stage perfected cultivator, and your senior brother is a little inferior, but he is also a Yuanying perfected cultivator. At the same time, he also inherited the position of the Kunlun party's sect leader, and his name is known all over the world. Compared to these 2 geniuses, Jindan friar? What was that? There were always people who felt that if others did not reach the expectations that they randomly set in their hearts, it was because that person did not work hard or had poor talent. It was all that person's fault. However, no one really wanted to understand why that person was like that. White Lotus was a mature child. It could even be said that she was terrifyingly mature in private. However, she was still too young, and there would always be some things that she had not experienced or thought of. Just like now, she kept intentionally or unintentionally comparing second senior brother before her with her master and eldest senior brother, and then she got the impression that he seemed to be inferior. However, although his achievements were poor, he was still a good person. Zhuxian treated White Lotus pretty well. He was probably the person who treated her the best on Winter Peak. White Lotus revealed a rare smile and nodded to Zhuxian. She thought to herself, this second senior brother really knows how to conduct himself. She quickly walked away. Zhuxian watched as White Lotus left, his eyes remaining gentle. From the beginning to the end, he saw the changes in White Lotus's expression, but it did not affect him too much. How many years had it been? How many people had intentionally or unintentionally looked down on him? This was very normal, wasn't it? Zhuxian could even guess what this little girl, White Lotus, was thinking. He knew that she did not do it on purpose. No matter who it was, after having a deity transformation stage master and a nascent soul Taoist master who was also the Kunlun sect leader's senior brother, everyone's expectations of him would become very high. It was so high that if they only cultivated to the level of Jindan Friar, it would be a kind of sin. The wind and snow blew from afar, and White Lotus's figure disappeared in the distance. The smile on Zhuxian's face slowly disappeared, and his expression gradually became indifferent. It looked like the wind and snow on this winter peak. It was cold and piercing. He quietly looked at this familiar white world. Every cliff, every icicle, every mountain path, and even every piece of wind and snow that had been blown by felt so familiar to him. He had spent a long time here. He raised his head and looked at the violent wind and snow at the highest point of this mountain. That place seemed to be above the ninth heaven, as if it was always so high and unreachable. After a while, he suddenly laughed, with a hint of self-mockery. There were still many traces left behind from last night's stormy night. Under the hazy sky, the dark clouds gathered into a thick blanket, slowly rolling, as if they were brewing something. And on a nameless peak outside of Kunlun, a black shadow was slowly walking towards the highest peak. It was Black Dog. After a night, it seemed to have gone through another brutal battle. The bruises all over its body returned to its body. Fresh blood flowed continuously and dyed a large area of the ground red. But Atsu was not the most miserable. There were many more miserable than it, such as those who had fallen dead on both sides of the mountain path, or those who had rolled directly into the cliff and died. The air was filled with a murderous and bloody smell. Some heavy breathing sounds rose and fell, echoing in the shadows of this mountain. Behind Atsu, in the gaps between the grass and the trees, behind the branches and leaves of the forest, one could see some bright or murderous eyes everywhere. At the same time, in the area between these terrifying gazes and Atsu, near the mountain path, there was a scene of chaos. Blood flowed everywhere, flesh and bone fragments could be seen everywhere. It was like a feast of slaughter. Atsu's sharp teeth and the corners of its mouth were dripping with blood. The closer it was to the night of the full moon, the more power Atsu could feel in its body throbbing. It was like a wild volcano that was about to erupt and let out a terrible roar towards the world. It felt as if something was going to happen to it soon. However, the holy blood that flowed out of the tracking holy beast, as well as the numerous demonic beasts that were attracted by the strange blood fragrance, had already surrounded it excitedly. It was the most coveted delicacy in the world for holy beasts. It was a supreme treasure that could make holy beasts obtain great power and use it to advance. This was not a legend, but the instinct of all holy beasts. Therefore, when the terrifying and strange smell of blood spread out, all the demonic beasts within a radius of 100 miles went crazy. The boundary between life and death seemed to no longer be so important at this moment, and their instinctive desires seemed to have taken over. Do you want to stand out? Do you want to go to the top? These waves of hostility, like raging waves and raging tides, are desperately trying to pull you, drag you, hurt you, and murder you. Why can you do it and why can't I? Eat your flesh, drink your blood, maybe I can too? Therefore, the wind and clouds gathered, and the world was covered in haze. Every step seemed to be accompanied by blood. The black dog had never felt so lonely before. Even when it was young and had followed that man, it had thought that all of this would never happen again. However, at this moment, when it looked up at the hazy sky and breathed in the eerie and terrifying cold wind, it finally understood. It was the only one on this road, and it could only walk alone. The black dog looked back, and its single eye was filled with a cruel light. The auras hidden in the shadows suddenly flinched, as if they were shocked by the ferocity. However, that was all they could do. Before the bloody feast, before the king had reached the top, who would give up on this blood feast? The cold wind blew, and Atsu suddenly thought of Lu Chen. Was that person still on that mountain? After this night of the full moon, would they still be able to see each other? Atsu did not know the answer to this question, and perhaps that person did not know either. It gently shook the remaining half of its tail. This scene suddenly looked a little tragic and comical in the midst of its ferocious and bloody aura. Then, it turned around once again. Even though it was a dog, it seemed to be looking down on the world. It ignored all the greedy gazes, the covetous gazes, and the bloody wounds on its body. Step by step, it faced the wind and walked toward the highest peak of the mountain. It looked forward to the arrival of the night. It looked forward to the appearance of the full moon. Two people stood on the towering city wall of Kunwa City and looked at the majestic Kunlun mountain range in the distance. They were Fan Tue and Qin He. Dark clouds hung low in the hazy sky, stacking on top of each other. Along with the waves of cold wind blowing from the mountain, this caused the world to have a murderous aura. The mountain was so tall that it was like a god. It stood proudly as if it was too high to be reached. Fan Tue and Qin He did not look good. They were a little gloomy. However, in comparison, Fan Tue's eyes were more ferocious, while Qin He was more composed. Amidst the cold wind, Qin He was the first to speak. Is the annual faction meeting of the Kunlun party being held on the mountain? Fan Tue nodded and said, yes. This is the most important event of the year for the Kunlun party. All the important figures will participate. As he spoke, he suddenly grunted and said, if a meteorite suddenly fell from the sky today, it would be able to subdue this damned faction. Even though the atmosphere was originally serious, Qin He, who was usually composed, could not help but laugh when he heard Fan Tue's words. He then shook his head and muttered to himself for a moment. In other words, today on the mountain of Kunlun is the day when the Kunlun party is most concentrated? Fan Tue replied, almost. Qin He asked, do you have any arrangements? Fan Tue was silent for a moment, then said, the enemy is strong and we are weak. There is nothing we can do. We can only get our spies to watch carefully and not act rashly. Qin He nodded and said, that is also a wise move. He paused for a moment and looked at Fan Tue. Speaking of which, I suddenly have an idea recently. I would like to discuss it with you. Fan Tue said, please speak. Qin He said, the Western continent is very vast, and there are many cultivation families. Even though the Kunlun party is very powerful, it seems that we do not need to focus most of our efforts here. What do you think? Fan Tue frowned and did not speak. Qin He smiled and said, even though we have suffered some setbacks previously, our foundations have not been damaged. It is better for us to develop in secret and endure for now. In the future, when the Holy Church recovers and becomes strong again, we can naturally find trouble with these people again. Fan Tue looked at the distant Kunlun mountain and suddenly said, but there is still a brother on the mountain that we have not contacted. That is a person who could set up the reincarnation array. How can we give up so easily? Qin He frowned and muttered, speaking of this, I have been thinking about this matter for the past 2 days. I have a feeling that this matter is a little strange. Chapter 222. Fan Tue was shocked and asked, what's strange? Qin He said, how many people in the Holy Church do you think can draw the reincarnation array? Fan Tue froze for a moment before replying, of course it's a senior with a high level of cultivation. At least 10 years ago, I heard that only the elders of the Holy Church could draw it. Qin He looked at him and said in a deep voice, you are right. That was indeed the case 10 years ago. However, the seniors in the Holy Church have withered. 4 of the 5 great elders of the past have passed away. Only Elder Ghost is left. However, it can't be him. Fan Tui's expression changed slightly. After a moment of silence, he furrowed his brows and said, "Perhaps it's a disciple left behind by the other elders? Or are they the experts that Elder Ghost has trained over the years?" Chen He shook his head and said, "That's impossible. I am well aware of the manpower of Elder Ghost. No one would come to Kunlun. As for the disciples left behind by the other 4 elders, there are naturally outstanding geniuses. However, they are also well-known people in the Holy Church. They are definitely not strangers who are hiding here and have cut off all ties with us." Fan Tui's brows furrowed even tighter. He said, "Based on what you said, this is indeed strange. However, the reincarnation array that appeared on Kunlun Mountain is undoubtedly the real deal from the various information we have received. However, if the person in the Holy Church who can draw this array is not here, how did this array appear?" Chen He's expression was dark. He raised his head and looked deeply at Kunlun Mountain, which was shrouded in dark clouds in the distance. Fan Tui continued to mumble beside him, "Could it be that such a high-level array formation has been leaked? If the person in the Holy Church who can really draw this array is not here, then no one in the world can set it up." "No!" Suddenly, Chen He interrupted him. At that moment, his expression was suddenly filled with dark clouds. Even his eyes revealed a strong murderous intent. In this world, other than the few heroes in the Holy Church who can set up this array, there is another person with such ability outside of the Holy Church. Fan Tui was shocked and asked, "Who is it?" Chen He clenched his teeth tightly. A moment later, a cold gust of wind seemed to seep out from between his teeth. He said word by word, "A traitor!" Clang! The melodious sound of the bell reverberated on the majestic Tiankuan Peak. Everyone in the Jianghu Grand Hall turned around solemnly. The originally somewhat lively and noisy atmosphere quickly subsided, and the Grand Hall fell into silence. Suddenly he heard the sound of clothes fluttering. Someone was walking over. The bronze doors at the back of the main hall opened one by one, and a row of Taoist children came out in a single file, with a dragon embroidered on the left and a phoenix on the right. The iron cauldron was emitting green smoke, and the cloud board was emitting an auspicious sound. Cranes soared, beasts roared, and auspicious clouds appeared. There was a tall platform in the majestic main hall. Immortal energy floated about like floating clouds. A moment later, he sat on the main seat, nodded his head and smiled as he looked around. The cloud board rang out in succession. The sound was clear and melodious, each louder than the last, like the waves of a great river, each louder than the last. In a short moment, it actually had the momentum of a magnificent army surging forward. A gust of wind blew across the large hall, fluttering everyone's clothes. The hall was filled with heroes. It was as if the essence of 1,000 years of inheritance had been passed down here. It was the golden age of the human world. They couldn't help but feel a sense of heroism in their hearts. They felt that everything in the world was easy. There was nothing that they couldn't achieve. At the side, there were people singing and greeting, offering sacrifices to the ancestors, the sect, and thanking the heavens and the earth. The people in the seats looked up and saw that everyone was respectful. Looking further away, they also saw those extraordinary people sitting at a small table at the side of the hall. Reverend Idlemonth's gaze swept over. Those Yuanying Jinren who supported him also smiled and nodded. Everyone did not specially greet him. As long as he came, it had already explained everything. But the next moment, Reverend Idlemonth suddenly frowned. He realized that he actually did not see Dukan Jinren in the crowd. His face slightly darkened, but he quickly relaxed. Dukan Jinren and he were not ordinary friends. All these years, everyone had supported each other. Reverend Idlemonth completely did not think that Dukan Jinren would have any estrangement with him, let alone oppose him. Thinking about it, Dukan Jinren probably had some urgent matters to deal with at the Heavenly Soldier Hall. This was also okay. The big meeting during the day was originally glorious. The most important thing was the small meeting tonight. Presumably, at that time, junior brother Dukan would definitely not let him down. At least after so many years, he had never let him down. Reverend Idlemonth was relieved, and just as he was about to retract his gaze, his eyes suddenly paused again. He saw that at the back of the crowd, there was a face that was not too familiar to him previously. Dongfang Tao stood at the small table and nodded at Reverend Idlemonth from afar. His face was smiling, and his expression was natural. Reverend Idlemonth stared at him for a moment, and a trace of a smile slowly floated on his lips. Then he also smiled and nodded at Dongfang Tao, his eyes filled with gratification. Lukan Junren and he walked into the depths of the forest. The forest was deep, and the light was somewhat dim. Because of the rain 2 days ago, the ground in the forest had also become wet and soft, and some places were even covered in mud, looking very dirty. However, of course, these things would not be a problem for 2 cultivators with cultivation, especially since their cultivation was extremely high. One was the newly advanced Jindan friar, and the other was Reverend Yuaning, who had been famous for many years. Drops of water dripped from the edges of the branches and leaves, and the soft sound seemed to make the forest seem even more quiet. Perhaps it was because the rain was too heavy, there were no traces of wild beasts in the vicinity, and even the occasional chirping of birds was rarely heard today. Light and shadow intertwined and changed on their faces, reflecting different expressions. It was as if black and white were constantly intertwining, walking in the light and darkness. The sound of footsteps could be heard as they stepped on the ground. Under the big tree, beside the big rock, in the rotten leaves and black mud, a small and inconspicuous branch trembled slightly. After a moment, the 2 figures appeared in this place. Dukan Jinren looked around, his eyes sharp, and asked he, "Is this the place?" He took a step forward and said, "Yes." Dukan Jinren nodded, took 2 steps forward and said, "Right now no one is here yet. Where is the place where you first discovered the evil sect talisman? Let me see." He nodded and said, Teacher, please wait for a moment. I remember it is behind that big rock." After speaking, he strode towards that big rock. Dukan Jinren stood where he was, turned and looked around. The surrounding forest was densely forested, far more than the outskirts of the forest. In the dim corners, shadows could be seen, as if there were always some strange gazes looking at this place in the darkness. Dukan Jinren frowned, feeling somewhat unhappy. He thought, as expected, the evil sect's evil people were all cowardly and weak, even arranging to meet at these ghostly and shady places. It was really pitiful and laughable. And at this moment, not more than 3 chi away from his feet, under a few withered and rotten leaves, that tree branch stopped there, not moving at all. At this moment, he had already walked behind that big rock. Dukan Jinren stood still and waited. That tree branch was like a dead object. Everything seemed to have frozen in that instant, as if time had stopped. Suddenly a breeze blew past, bringing with it a slight chill. "Ah!" Suddenly, a loud cry was heard from behind the big rock. It was Heyi's voice, unusually tragic, with some traces of surprise. Dukan Jinren's body shook, suddenly turned around and saw his most beloved disciple Heyi, staggering and retreating from behind the big rock, spitting out fresh blood, hoarsely shouted, "Mingzhu Shu, why is this?" Dukan Jinren's body shook again, while he was still in shock. Indeed, in front of Heyi, a figure turned out from behind the big rock. It was a face that could not be more familiar. It was Mingzhu Jinren. At that moment, huge waves surged in Dukan Jinren's heart. No matter what, he would never have thought the one he waited for was an illustrious and famous person who was not any weaker than himself, Yuaning Jinren from the Kunlun party. Could it be that he was the evil sect spy? And without waiting for Dukan Jinren to react, that Mingzhu Jinren's cold eyes swept over, also saw him. At that moment, Dukan Jinren saw that Mingzhu Jinren's face suddenly revealed a shocked expression, followed by a trace of anger, shouted towards this side, "Dukong! It's actually you. So you are the evil sect spy." Hearing that, Dukan Jinren was shocked. Just as he was about to open his mouth to explain, suddenly he heard the sound of the wind behind him. In an instant, as if the mountains were collapsing, the earth was cracking, the deep sea was raging. A few incomparably violent auras simultaneously rose from the depths of the forest, pressing towards him with a loud bang. Dukan Jinren shouted, but did not turn around. Instead, he directly rushed forward. In front of him, Mingzhu Jinren's face was as calm as water. With a kick, he sent He flying, his sleeves fluttered, his whole body flew into the air. the surrounding spiritual light instantly condensed into a 10-foot light sword, directly chopping down. Wherever it passed, dust flew, trees fell, rocks cracked. Dukhan Jinren's eyes widened, his hands suddenly made a circle, a part of the cloud condensed into a shield, blocking in front of his body, only to hear a loud bang. That unstoppable light sword collided with the cloud shield, an ear-piercing sound was heard. Immediately after, both turned into nothingness. At the same time, the raging aura behind him had already reached him. At this critical moment, Dukhan Jinren fully displayed the foundation of his many years of fame as a Yuanying enlightened master. His body shone brilliantly, and 3 magic treasures appeared one after another, turning into a pagoda, a bell, and a halberd. At this critical moment, he forcibly blocked the soul-chasing attack, flipped his body, and forcibly rushed out from the side. Even so, his chest was stuffy, and a mouthful of blood directly sprayed out from his chest. When he turned around, he saw 3 people walking out of the forest, causing his expression to greatly change. Impressively, it was Enlightened Master Qian Deng, Enlightened Master Guangyang, and Masato Kihara, the 3 great Yuanying enlightened masters. He saw Enlightened Master Qian Deng at the forefront, glaring at them and shouting, "Dukong! You colluded with the evil sect to infiltrate our sect. This is truly a heinous crime. Why don't you surrender now?" Dukong was aghast. "Preposterous! You are all slandering me." However, after all, he was not an ordinary person, and in a flash, he saw through the treacherous situation. He sneered, "You want to slander me, but don't even think about it. I will go find Senior Brother Sect Master to explain." With that said, his body moved, and he was about to fly into the sky. But at this moment, Enlightened Master Ming Zhu sneered, suddenly raised his hand, and struck he, who was already injured and leaning against a tree. Immediately, there was a frightening sound of bones breaking, and he staggered and struggled, blood spurting everywhere, and with tears in his eyes, he shouted to the sky, "Master, quickly leave." Dukhan Jinren, who was about to fly, suddenly stopped. Chapter 223. In Jingyang Hall, everything was still proceeding in an orderly manner. At least during the day, there were still many tedious but important rituals that needed to be done one by one. They couldn't be careless when paying respect to the world and ancestors. As perfected Yuanying, he was naturally more relaxed than ordinary people. Most of the time, he only needed to stand to the side and watch. He only needed to bow and pay respects during the most important activities. Dongfang Tao had been doing it very calmly without any impatience. During this time, Melaleuca Japonica took advantage of a gap when no one was paying attention to whisper to him, "Why are there fewer people than we expected from perfected Yuanying's side?" Dongfang Tao's expression didn't change as he replied softly, "Didn't I say long ago that this day isn't important? It's probably because those fellow Taoists can't be bothered to come." Melaleuca Japonica shook her head and said, "I think something's wrong. Look, even Dukong didn't come." Dongfang Tao glanced at her and said, "It's fine if you're talking about others, but I don't believe that old man Dukong would be at odds with Idle Month." Melaleuca Japonica thought for a moment and nodded. "You're right. Dukong is indeed perfected sect master's loyal follower. He won't betray him. However, isn't this strange? If that's the case, why hasn't he come after so long?" Dongfang Tao said, "Something must have delayed him." Melaleuca Japonica fell silent. Dongfang Tao waited for a while and saw that she didn't say anything. Instead, he looked at her and asked softly, "What's wrong? In the past, you've always been able to see through everything in the sect. Your senses are far sharper than mine. Otherwise, I wouldn't have always listened to you. Do you feel that something's wrong today?" Melaleuca Japonica wanted to say something but hesitated. After hesitating for a moment, she whispered, "Actually, it's nothing. It looks good, but Hakushin Jinkuin released the news 2 days ago that he's coming today." Dongfang Tao was taken aback for a moment before he said, "That's right. Uncle Master Bai Chun wants to come and support his disciple, but he will definitely come at night." Melaleuca Japonica glanced at him and asked, "Then why did you come here during the day?" Dongfang Tao smiled and said, I'm doing this to show my sincerity to the sect leader, to show my sincerity. Before he finished speaking, his expression suddenly changed, as if he had thought of something. In order to show Jinren Idle Month and Hakushin Jinkuin, who was even more powerful, he came to support the Jinren during the day. This was a kind of attitude, a very clear and unambiguous attitude. But why didn't the others think of it? In the distance, Perfected Idle Month finished paying her respects to the ancestral master. She retreated to the side and looked over through the gap. Dongfang Tao raised his eyes and looked over. Both of them smiled at each other and nodded. A moment later, Perfected Idle Month looked away. The smile on Dongfang Tao's face slowly disappeared. A moment later, he said in a low voice, "It seems that something is really wrong." Boom! In the sky outside the main hall, the sound of thunder suddenly came from the gathering dark clouds. Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca japonica raised their heads and looked outside. After a moment, Melaleuca japonica said softly, "It seems like it's going to rain again." It started raining again. The rain was not heavy. In the beginning, there were only a few drops. Slowly, it became denser. However, it was still a light drizzle that drifted down from the clouds. It made the world and the towering Kunlun Mountains look a little blurry and hazy. The sound of thunder traveled into the darkness and into the shadows. Most people in this world, most of the time, felt that the darkness was scary, gloomy, terrifying, and disgusting. Very few people liked the darkness, just like how most people naturally liked the light. However, there were also very few people who liked the darkness. They felt that the darkness was also warm. They felt that the darkness was a kind of protection. When they were lonely, they would think of it. For example, the legendary evil sect. Many people in the world felt that they naturally belonged to the darkness. This was of course a misunderstanding. As long as one was human, it was hard to change one's nature. Even for the evil sect people, most of them liked the light and hated the darkness. However, the devil sect of the three realms had such a long history that even the followers of the devil sect could not remember how long it had been. Since ancient times, they had actually passed down many unimaginable and bizarre Taoist arts and divine powers. Among them, there was an extremely rare and strange skill that made one hold his breath like a dead thing. Even the heartbeat almost stopped. As long as one's cultivation was deep enough, one could avoid the senses of some powerful cultivators. But the senses were still there. Therefore, in the deepest darkness, he seemed to have seen everything. It started to rain again. The water droplets seeped into the soil. That chill was like a knife piercing into the flesh and bone marrow. He had been waiting for the figure that should have appeared. However, the one that should have appeared did not. The one that should not have appeared came a lot. He could not even distinguish the layers of illusions in this chaotic situation. Therefore he could only hide in the darkness and wait in silence. Dukan Jinren's eyes widened in anger. He looked angrily at Mingzhu. His teeth were clenched. Mingzhu looked at him with a cold smile. He said disdainfully, "Evildoer." Du Kong looked at He, who was vomiting blood. He said with grief and indignation, "You and I are both Yuanying Jinren. You have the nerve to attack such a young man?" Mingzhu sneered. "You put it nicely. If you have the guts, come and fight me for 300 rounds? Du Kong snorted. His face changed. In this treacherous situation, his many years of experience allowed him to maintain a clear mind. He said coldly, "I am not a spy from the evil sect. There is a misunderstanding. I will explain it to sect head senior brother. If you guys dare to lay your hands on my disciple, be careful that I will be ruthless in the future." After saying that, he hardened his heart. Without looking at he turned around and left. With Zhenren Yuanying's level of cultivation, it was easy to defeat him but hard to capture him. Killing him was even more difficult. The few Yuanying Zhenren looked at each other. Suddenly, Qian Deng, who had not spoken since the beginning, took a step forward. He said in a deep voice, "Are you really not a spy from the evil sect?" "But," Dukan Jinren said hatefully, "I have been in the Kunlun party for many years. Don't you know what kind of person I am? Do I look like a spy from the evil sect?" Qian Deng nodded slowly. He seemed to be moved by his words. He said in a deep voice, "Logically speaking, it is true. There must be a mistake somewhere. We also received a secret report from a spy who said that the spy from the evil sect would meet here." Dukan Jinren was shocked. He quickly said, "Me too." Qian Deng frowned. "So it is. It seems that there is a mistake. Shitty, return He to Dukong Shixiang." On the other side, Ming Zhu shrugged. He picked up He and threw him toward Dukan Jinren like a stone. Dukan Jinren cried out in alarm. He subconsciously reached out to catch him. At the same time, he saw He's bleeding face. His heart ached. Very quickly, the sound of the wind swept past. He reached out to hold his most beloved disciple in his arms. In that split second, his body suddenly shook. His mind was suddenly in turmoil. He thought of something he had overlooked before. He learned about the evil sect spy's secret pattern from He. But where did He come from? Right, he said that he found it here. Why did Qian Deng, Ming Zhu, and the others say that they discovered the evil sect spy's secret after learning about the secret pattern? How did they find the secret pattern? At this time, he should be in the Tian Kun Peak's Jianghu. Why did he come to this secluded and uninhabited mountain forest? And Qian Deng, Ming Zhu, Guangyang, and Mu Yuan, these 4 Yuaning Jinren, also came here? Everything seemed to be a little off. His heart suddenly stopped beating, and he suddenly held his breath. A deep and frightening panic quietly attacked him, wrapping around his body. Dukan Jinren didn't want to believe this cold premonition, but his reason coldly reminded him. He subconsciously loosened his grip on He. He wanted to step back, but at the same time, he saw his disciple's eyes. He's eyes were brimming with tears. He's face was filled with grief. Tears quickly flowed down. He's face was covered with tears. He's voice was hoarse. He softly called out, "Master?" Dukan Jinren halted his steps. He suddenly felt a chill on his lower abdomen. Boom! At that moment, in the vault of heaven, a sudden clap of thunder resounded from the dark clouds. The sound shook the surroundings as if to tear apart the vault of heaven and earth. Accompanied by the rumbling thunder, lightning like silver snakes swam in the dark clouds. The rain suddenly became heavier and began to rush into this gray and gloomy world. The heavy rain fell on Taoist Master Dukong's face, which seemed to have suddenly aged 10 years. As a result, many deep wrinkles that no one had noticed before appeared on his face. It was only now that people realized that this person was already an old man. An old man who had reached the end of his life and was about to die. 4 huge and dark figures slowly approached. They were the auras of 4 extremely powerful Yuanying enlightened masters. When they gathered together, their power was enough to split the mountains and split the earth. Just the invisible power seemed to have cut off any connection between this place and the outside world. Not even the slightest sound could be heard. But Dukan Jinren no longer cared. He just looked at He in a daze. His mouth squirmed a few times. Then he lowered his head to look at his lower abdomen. There was a bright blade there. It was as cold as snow. It directly cut through the incomparably tough flesh and skin of the Yuanying enlightened master like cutting a piece of paper. It went straight into the sea of qi in his lower abdomen and penetrated all the barriers. With a terrible and cruel aura, it directly pierced through the 5 elements disc in Dukan Jinren's dantian. Like a demon, it ferociously nailed him to death on the blade. Then, it broke out of his body and along the way, it also cut off his spine. The blade had a handle. The handle was held in his disciple's hand. It was steady and powerful. Chapter 224. Hot blood gushed out of Dukan Jinren's wand like a fountain, drenching He's palm. In the blink of an eye, his hand was completely dyed bright red. He clenched his teeth and slowly raised his head. The master and disciple's gazes met at this moment. They were so close, yet it seemed as if they were thousands of miles apart. Why? Dukan Jinren coughed. His voice was low and hoarse. At the same time, it seemed that because his dantian had been destroyed, the qi channels in his body were instantly thrown into chaos. Spiritual energy tore through his meridians, and even blood kept gushing out of his mouth. He's lips trembled slightly. His eyes were slightly red and swollen. He opened his mouth a few times, but no words came out. Only the rain falling from the sky drenched his face with water droplets. The four huge shadows around him were getting closer and closer, but Dukan Jinren didn't seem to feel anything. At this moment, it was as if there was only he in front of him in his eyes. He looked at He, at the disciple that he had placed his life's hopes on. A bloody palm slowly rose up, trembling in the air, and touched He's face. Dukan Jinren's face was filled with sadness, pain, confusion, and disappointment, but his gaze was still gentle. It was as if the person in front of him was still his most beloved disciple. He's entire body trembled violently. He desperately bit his lips, trying to pretend to be strong and indifferent, but his eyes were already blurred. He couldn't tell if it was tears or rain. A hoarse voice came from his throat. He took a step forward, wanting to get close to that palm. But at this moment, a hand suddenly stretched out from behind Dukan Jinren and grabbed Dukan Jinren's bloody palm. The Thousand Lantern Spiritual Master's cold face appeared beside the two of them. In that split second, He's eyes suddenly widened as he saw the Thousand Lantern Spiritual Master's arms suddenly bend downwards. Kacha! In the heavy rain, a chill hit his face. He felt as if he had fallen into an ice cellar. He blankly watched as the Thousand Lantern Spiritual Master directly broke Dukan Jinren's wrist. Dukan Jinren let out a miserable howl. His entire body trembled and fell backwards. He abruptly raised his head and glared at Taoist Qian Deng. Just as he was about to roar in anger, he saw Taoist Qian Deng coldly flip over Taoist Dukong's hand that was still in his grasp. Under the washing of the rainwater, a needle-shaped magical treasure that flickered with a cold light was slowly revealed in between the bloody flesh and bone fragments. The needle was not large, but it was sharp enough to kill a rebellious disciple. Thousand Lanterns of the Spiritual Master, Spiritual Master's Spiritual Master, and Iyu's hand. He's face instantly turned deathly pale. He staggered a few steps back, looking as if it was very difficult for him to even stand. After saying those words, the Thousand Lantern Spiritual Master suddenly let out a light shout. His eyes shone brightly and an unstoppable aura suddenly emanated from him. As if sensing something, he raised his head. The other three Yuanying Spiritual Masters all had different expressions on their faces. Spiritual Master Mingzhu's face was indifferent as if he already knew the outcome. Spiritual Master Guangyang let out a long sigh and shook his head in silence. Only Misato Kihara was startled by Thousand Lantern Spiritual Master's sudden action. She wanted to say something but hesitated, but a trace of unwillingness flitted across her face. A moment later, Taoist Qian Deng abruptly struck out with his palm. At that moment, the countless raindrops in the forest were suddenly swept up by an unparalleled power, whistling in the air and forming a huge vortex. The wind and rain howled, as if the power of the heavens and earth had been injected into that palm, and it slammed down toward Taoist Qian Deng. At that moment, the palm struck Dukan Jinren's chest. There was no sound of bones breaking or flesh tearing. Under everyone's gazes, Dukan Jinren's chest instantly caved in. Having lost most of his vitality, Dukan Jinren was completely defenseless against such a powerful Yuanying Spiritual Master's attack. At that moment, his 5 viscera and 6 bowels were almost instantly crushed. Thousand Lantern Spiritual Master slowly took a step back. The whistling gradually subsided. The wind and rain seemed to have escaped from that terrifying prison with great difficulty and continued to fall aimlessly. Thousand Lantern Spiritual Master took out a handkerchief and began to slowly wipe his blood-stained palm. At the same time, he glanced at He and indifferently said, "Did you see it clearly? If you want to kill Yuanying Spiritual Master again in the future, you must do this." He's face was as pale as paper. He hung his head and bitterly said, "This disciple doesn't dare." Thousand Lantern Spiritual Master coldly snorted and looked at He with a trace of disdain in his eyes. He then turned around and walked to the side. Boom! Another clap of thunder sounded in the sky. Although it was not yet dark, Kunlun Mountain was as gloomy as dusk under the thick dark clouds. The rain was getting heavier and heavier. The cold raindrops fell from the sky and hit Dukanjinren's old and bloodless face. Everything around him seemed to suddenly be very far away. At that moment, he seemed to suddenly think of many things. From childhood to adulthood, from birth to death, how had he lived his life? Had he regretted it? Had he felt gratitude? Had he felt pain? Had he felt joy? However, everything seemed to suddenly become abnormally light and was replaced by an incomparably heavy fatigue. Exhaustion drowned him like a tide, bringing darkness with it as it swept over. Finally, his body could not hold on any longer. The body that was once tall and proud in the world, with a powerful cultivation, finally lost all its vitality on this day and fell down dejectedly. With a thud, he fell heavily on the dirty ground. Black mud splashed on his face, rotten leaves jumped up and down in front of his eyes, which were still open. In his final moments in this life, he had never imagined that he would meet death in such a manner. The heavy rain hit his body, and the coldness spread. His body twitched and then gradually stiffened. He was about to die. He was about to die. Everyone could see it, including Dukanjinren himself. He waited for the final moment in pain and sorrow. However, at this moment, his eyes, which had fallen into the dirty mud on the ground, suddenly saw that just a few inches in front of him, under the rotten leaves that had just been shaken up, there was a seemingly unremarkable tree branch stuck in the mud. He saw that tree branch. That tree branch seemed to have sensed him. The wind and rain roared, sweeping away the darkness and filth of this world. However, in that moment of death, Dukanjinren's pair of absent-minded eyes suddenly had a strange luster. He seemed to be startled. But very quickly, the corners of his mouth slowly rose into a strange smile. At that moment, the sky full of wind and rain and the surrounding tall trees, including those even more terrifying figures, seemed to have disappeared from his eyes. In Dukanjinren's eyes, there was only that small tree branch left. There was black mud on the ground. The ice-cold rain continuously poured down, washing over their bodies. Perhaps sometimes, the gap between the living and the dead was only a thin layer of mud. He felt it, he seemed to understand something. He seemed to want to speak but couldn't. He laughed. His head tilted, and then he died with that trace of a strange smile. Boom! A sudden clap of thunder rang out. Everyone raised their heads to look at the sky, only to see lightning flashing across the sky like snakes. In the dirty underground, the tree branch also trembled slightly before slowly hiding under another piece of rotten, withered leaf. Everything as if it had never happened. When the clap of thunder exploded on the Tian-Kun Peak of Kunlun in the Jianghu Hall, the grand meeting of the sects was halfway through, and now it still had to continue with a grand and lively atmosphere. Su Qingjun stood in the crowd, feeling a little uneasy. Today's weather was a little abnormal. The thunder rumbled, and at the same time as the meeting of the sects was going on, it always made people feel a little uncomfortable. In fact, it was obvious that Su Qingjun was not the only one who felt this way. Among the many Kunlun disciples standing in the Jianghu Hall, many of them would steal a few glances at the sky outside the hall. Of course, no one had ever said that the heavens did not allow thunder and rain during the meeting of the sections. In order to understand the power of creation and stealing from the heavens, most of the time it was still important to take advantage of the situation. The saying that man can conquer nature, in the many years of history of cultivation, had long been proven to be meaningless. In front of the true power of heaven and earth, all things in the world were perhaps ants. Therefore, they still did what they had to do, even if it was thunder and rain. At least, on the high platform of the Jianghu Hall, the head of Kunlun, Idle Month, always had a calm expression. Her deep self-restraint could be seen clearly, and she had a bearing that would not change even if the heavens and earth collapsed in front of her. It was really admirable. Taking advantage of the short break in the middle, Su Qingjun walked to the side of Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca japonica and greeted the two of them. Melaleuca japonica seemed to really like Su Qingjun. She smiled and pulled her up, saying, "There are many eyes here, you don't have to be so polite." Su Qingjun agreed, and then said a few more words to them. However, these two were old and experienced cultivators, and very quickly, They could tell that Su Qingjun did not mean what she said. Melaleuca japonica smiled and asked, "What's wrong, June girl? If you have something to ask, just say it." A trace of embarrassment flashed across Su Qingjun's face, but after a while, she still gathered her courage and said to Dongfang Tao, "Martial Uncle Dongfang, I want to ask, yesterday you said that the power of heaven and earth might affect Sumo's recovery, but this, such a powerful thunderstorm, does it count?" Dongfang Tao laughed and shook his head. Melaleuca japonica also sighed softly, and said with a smile, "You are confused because you are too concerned. Don't worry, how can this degree of power count as the power of heaven and earth? It's fine." Su Qingjun nodded, looking as if she was relieved, but also a little embarrassed. Dongfang Tao said, "After tonight it should be fine." Melaleuca japonica said, "And there's also EXN watching." Su Qingjun made a sound of acknowledgement, and said, "I've really troubled younger sister EXN." Chapter 225. The rain continued to pour, and occasionally, lightning flashed across the dark sky. Thunder rumbled above the clouds. Atsu was already drenched, its black fur stuck to its body, and its broken body was covered with wounds and blood. It was not far from the mountain peak, but the ferocious demon beasts behind it were getting more and more irritable. There were constantly demon beasts driven by their natural greed pouncing on it, wanting to drink its blood and eat its flesh. Atsu's response was to bite them to death. Its sharp fangs were as sharp as blades, and it was as cruel as a demon. It was a beast that was more ferocious than these beasts, and whoever dared to stand in its way would fight to the death. It was a battle of life and death, and in this stormy day, there seemed to be no end to it. The rain drenched the black dog's body, and it felt a little cold and a little lonely. At that moment, it suddenly missed Lu Qin, and remembered the many nights when it slept quietly on the same bed with him. Perhaps, that was the most peaceful and happy moment of its life? Roar! A deep and mournful roar burst out from Atu's throat. He bit down on the throat of a demon beast that lunged at him in the wind and rain. He tore its flesh, swallowed its blood, and then threw the dead body to the side. The auras in the distance seemed to stop for a moment, and Atsu looked back in disdain, and then continued to walk towards the peak, panting. This day was so long. Even it did not know if it could make it through. Would he be able to see the rising of the bright moon in that cloudy and rainy weather? In the dense forest, someone said this. Let's wait until the sky turns dark. That's when we have important things to do, and at the same time, let's see if anyone will come." The people around had no objections, so they walked to a secluded corner, sat down quietly, and waiting for nightfall. Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca japonica were waiting for the end of this ceremony, waiting for the important small meeting that would take place in the evening. Su Qingjun was also waiting for the end of this grand ceremony so that she could go back to visit her younger brother Sumo as soon as possible. Perhaps, if she could make it in time, Sister Exen would be able to find that man to come see her. In the guest room of the flowing fragrance garden, Exen was sprawled on the table in boredom, staring at the continuous rain outside the window in a daze, as if she had lost her mind. At the same time, White Lotus had already descended from the winter peak amidst the clouds in the sky. She walked towards the front of Kunlun Mountain with a relaxed expression. Behind her, the strange mountain that was floating in midair was also covered with a layer of gray. The sky had unknowingly darkened. Rain poured down from the sky, enveloping the entire vast Kunlun mountain range, as if the entire world had become hazy. However, on the winter peak, there was not even a drop of rain. It was unknown whether it was because there was a powerful prohibition that isolated the rain outside, or because the rain fell in, but the overly cold wind and snow on the winter peak had condensed the rain into ice and snow. On the lonely and quiet winter peak, other than the violent wind and snow on the highest peak, Zhuoxian seemed to be the only person left on the entire mountain. He stood at the edge of a cliff, gazing down. For many years, he had stood at this place, gazing at the majestic Kunlun Mountain, and was especially familiar with the undulating mountains of Kunlun. He could even tell where the majestic Tiankuan Peak was at a glance, and he could also imagine how lively and bustling it was at this moment. For many years at this time he would be in the Jianghu Hall on Tianquan Peak, rejoicing for the sect, cheering for his senior brother, and being proud of his sect. However, he had never thought about himself in the slightest. Zhuxian lowered his eyes slightly, and after a moment he turned around and walked towards his cave abode. The wind and snow outside were isolated, and he took out the wind speech plate, placed it on the table, and opened it. The sound of wind and snow was immediately heard, and after a moment, Hakushin Jinkuan's voice came from this strange magic treasure. "What's the matter?" Zhuxian showed a respectful expression, bowed, and said, "Master, you're going to watch over eldest senior brother's place tonight. May I know when you're going to leave?" Hakushin Jinkuan's voice said, "What time is it now?" "It's already afternoon, and it'll be dusk in 2 hours, so I wanted to come and ask if you have any arrangements." Hakushin Jinkuan paused for a moment, and then said, "There's no other arrangements, just do as we originally agreed. I'll come down in 2 hours." Zhuxian cupped his fists and bowed, and said respectfully, "Yes, I'll wait here for master." On the wind speech plate, the wind and snow disappeared, and gradually, it returned to its original unremarkable appearance. Zhuxian straightened his body, and his face was slightly pale, as if he was in a daze, thinking about something. A gust of cold wind suddenly blew from behind, and there was a slight chill on the back of his neck. Zhuxian's body tensed up, and he suddenly turned around and shouted, "Who's there?" At the entrance of his cave abode, the stone door had silently opened, and after a moment, an unusually tall and burly figure appeared at the entrance of his cave abode. The dark shadow then surged into his cave abode and completely covered him. Zhuxian took a step back, and his expression suddenly showed some nervousness, but then he took a deep breath, and his body slowly relaxed. "You've come?" he asked in a low voice, and for some reason, there seemed to be a little bitterness in his tone. The huge figure responded, and after a while, the person suddenly asked again, "Do you regret it?" The expression on Zhuxian's face changed, and he did not answer immediately. The huge figure also seemed to be unusually patient, and did not impatiently interrogate him, but quietly waited outside the cave abode. After a while, Zhuxian said, "There's nothing to regret." The tall figure outside the cave abode responded, and then, suddenly, a white light flashed, and something was thrown in from outside the cave. Zhuxian stretched out his hand to grab it, and when he looked at it, he found that it was a jade bottle in his hand. He hesitated for a moment, and still opened the bottle cap to take a look. He saw that there were no pills in the jade bottle, and it was filled with black water. But for some reason, the black water did not have a fishy smell, but faintly carried a strange fragrance, like the fragrance of ambergris. Zhuxian's hand suddenly trembled, and his pair of eyes stared fixedly at the jade bottle. Both of his hands clenched tightly, as if he was 1,000, 10,000 times afraid that he would accidentally drop the jade bottle. "I think you know what to do, right?" Zhuxian slightly lowered his head, and after a while he softly said, "Yes, I know." In the depths of the damp mountain forest, the 4 Yuanying spiritual masters and the only one, Jin Dan Friar, He had been waiting. However, the so-called traitor did not appear, and there was no trace of anyone approaching in the surroundings. No one spoke, and in the heavy rain, everyone waited until the sky was about to turn dark. Somewhere in the distance, there seemed to be a lively scene of gongs and drums, and celestial music floating in the air. It was not too clear, but on this day the Yuanying spiritual masters had seen the liveliness of Tianquan Peak. Qian Deng and Ming Zhu looked into the distance with ridicule on their faces. He, on the other hand, was sitting on the ground in a daze. Occasionally he would glance at Taoist Du Kong's corpse, which was still lying on the ground. Then he would immediately look away with a trace of guilt and a trace of pain in his eyes. "Aren't we going to participate in the sect council tonight?" At this time, the one who suddenly spoke was Masato Kihara, his brows slightly wrinkled. "Waiting here for half a day without anyone coming, there's no need to continue waiting." He wanted to say something, but stopped on second thought. Except for him, everyone present was a powerful and profound Yuanying spiritual master, so there was indeed no room for him to speak. Qian Deng next to him looked over, saying, "In any case, There is indeed a devil sex secret pattern that was first engraved here. Let's not do anything else, just treat it as a matter of convenience. Let's wait for the sky to turn dark. If there really is a devil sect traitor coming, we will capture him. If the current situation has already alerted the enemy and he doesn't dare to come, then there's no harm, we just need to carry on with our business as agreed. Masato Kihara nodded slowly, saying, "Okay, I understand." The cloud board clattered, the bell and drum sounded in unison. In Tianquan Peak's Jianghu Hall, the tedious but solemn and lively ceremony was finally nearing completion. Many people had a trace of exhaustion on their faces, but Perfected Idol Month, who was standing on the high platform, was calm and did not seem to be tired at all. When the people at the side saw this, they naturally felt that Perfected Idol Month was indeed an amazing Yuanying spiritual master. He actually did not look tired at all after hosting the meeting for such a long time. But what should come will come. These ceremonies were completed one by one, and at the last moment, Perfected Idol Month took a break from the busy work and took a look outside of Jianghu Hall. The sky outside was still drizzling, the lightning in the sky continued to pass through the clouds, and the thunder was like the roar of the heavens, causing large amounts of rain to pour down. The sky seemed to be darkening bit by bit. This day seemed to be over, but it also seemed like it was about to start. In the depths of the dense forest, the few Yuanying spiritual masters who had been resting with their eyes closed were abnormally calm and serene, giving people the impression that something earth-shattering was about to happen. Only when the sky slowly darkened and the night was about to envelop, Perfected Thousand Lanterns suddenly opened his eyes, looked up, and slowly stood up, saying, "It's about time, let's go." "Where did?" someone asked. "Tianquan Peak, Jianghu Hall." Perfected Thousand Lantern faintly said, his eyes staring into the distance, his face expressionless as he walked away. The other three perfected Yuanying spiritual masters and he also followed behind him. Following their departure, the forest quickly quieted down. On that dark land, next to Dukan Jinren's corpse, a hollow branch slowly moved, as if it wanted to rise, but after a moment, it suddenly sank back down and stayed in the same place, motionless. The sky darkened, and darkness descended on Kunlun Mountain. Lightning flashed and thunder rumbled in the sky, like a noisy banquet was slowly opening its curtains at this time. Chapter 226. At dusk, the grand and lively meeting finally ended. Everyone worshipped their ancestors and prayed that everything would go smoothly in the coming year. They thanked the ancestors of the Kunlun party for their blessings, allowing the Kunlun lineage to survive for thousands of years without being cut off. It was still thriving today. However, the weather that day seemed to be particularly bad. The rain outside was getting heavier, and the rumbling of thunder was incessant. Although it was only dusk, the sky was already as dark as night. Countless candles had already been lit in the huge Jianghu Hall. Otherwise, there would only be darkness left. Fortunately, the people gathered here today were all accomplished cultivators. One after another, they began to leave in an orderly manner. Only now did Immortal Idol Month let out a sigh of relief. Although it was very glorious to be the sect leader, it was indeed not an easy task to preside over the meeting for a day. He looked around with a calm expression. After a while, it would be the highlight of the day. Almost all the elites of the Kunlun sect would gather here. Although there were a few troublemakers who were not well behaved and said strange things all day long, as long as his master arrived and took charge of the meeting, everyone would naturally be obedient and there would be no more objections. This was the power of a soul formation perfected cultivator. Immortal Idol Month smiled slightly. He turned around and walked down the high platform, walking towards the back of Jianghu Hall. In the crowd, Su Qingjun said goodbye to Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca Japonica and followed the crowd out of the hall. As for Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca Japonica, they also had to part ways here. Only Immortal Yuanying could participate in the small gathering at night. Of course, the location of the gathering would not be in such a spacious Jianghu Hall, but in a side hall at the back of the hall. Many Kunlun disciples were leaving from the main entrance in an orderly manner. The queue was very long. Su Qingjun stood at the back of the queue and waited. Occasionally, she would look back and see Dongfang Tao and Melaleuca japonica chatting for a while. It seemed that Melaleuca japonica gave him a few words. After Dongfang Tao nodded in agreement, he also walked towards the door that Immortal Idol Month had left through. With him were a few other Yuanying perfected cultivators who had already arrived. Their destination was naturally the same. When they saw each other, they also smiled and nodded, including Dongfang Tao. Perhaps because he had arrived in the daytime, the expressions of those Yuanying perfected cultivators were very gentle and friendly when they saw him. They probably thought that he was also on their side. After a while, Su Qingjun walked out of Jianghu Hall. She had just stepped out of the tall main entrance of the hall when she stepped out of the hall. The sky had actually turned completely dark. Even the drizzle that was falling from the sky could not be seen clearly from a place that was slightly further away. The cold wind blew, and the cold rain fell on her face. There was a trace of coldness that seeped into her skin. And in a place further away, the wind and rain were hurried. The night was bleak and hazy. Even the figures of those towering mountains could not be seen. Boom! Just at this moment, above the dark clouds in the sky, a sudden clap of thunder sounded. A bolt of lightning pierced through the darkness of the vault of heaven. It was like a twisted silver snake that divided the entire sky into two halves. With the help of the lightning, Su Qingjun saw the sky full of wind and rain sweeping over. The human figures were walking briskly in the dim light of the night. Most of the people were trying to leave this place, but with the help of that bright light, it reflected a group of people who suddenly walked in the opposite direction. There were a total of 4 people. The Kunlun disciples who were near them were almost all startled. They bowed continuously. The person in the lead was the head of Baichao Tang, Immortal Qian Deng. Following behind him were Ming Zhu, Guang Yang, and Mu Yuan, the 3 Immortal Qian Deng. With 4 people gathered together, naturally, the momentum was extraordinary. Along the way, no one dared to block their way, and they smoothly walked over. Su Qingjun was a little surprised, but she still hurried forward to greet her master, Masato Kihara. At the same time, she also greeted the other 3 Immortal Qian Deng. Masato Kihara's expression was indifferent. After glancing at Su Qingjun, he said, "Have you also stayed here for the whole day?" Su Qingjun said, "Yes, disciple has been here all along." Masato Kihara nodded and said, "Now there's nothing else. You can go back and rest first." Su Qingjun replied with an "oh," and took a step back. Just as she was about to turn around and leave, she suddenly saw Immortal Ming Zhu, who was originally walking in front of Masato Kihara, suddenly turn around. After glancing at Su Qingjun, he called out, "Wait." Su Qingjun and Masato Kihara looked at Immortal Ming Zhu at the same time. Masato Kihara frowned and said, "Senior brother Ming Zhu, what do you mean?" Immortal Ming Zhu said, "Senior brother Mu Yuan, after we go in, we also lack someone to order around. If there's anything that needs to be reported, it'll be troublesome without someone to pass the message. I was wondering if I could trouble your disciple to wait here for a while?" As he spoke, there was a smile on his face. He looked amiable, but Masato Kihara's pupils shrank slightly. After a moment, he said in a deep voice, "It's enough for me to be here. There's no need for Qingjun to come here. There's no need." Immortal Ming Zhu smiled and said, "Just in case." As he said this, he looked up at Masato Kihara and said with a smile, "What's wrong?" Senior brother Mu Yuan doesn't seem to be willing? Masato Kihara gritted his teeth. When he was about to say something, he suddenly saw Immortal Ming Zhu, who was originally walking in front, suddenly look back with a cold expression. Masato Kihara was shocked and swallowed the words that were about to come out of his mouth. The atmosphere outside the hall suddenly became a little stiff. Su Qingjun was a little puzzled, but she could still feel the subtle atmosphere. She hurriedly said to Masato Kihara, "Master, it doesn't matter if I stay here a little longer." Masato Kihara's eyes turned cold, while Immortal Ming Zhu laughed and said, "You're really a good disciple who respects her master. Not bad indeed." Immortal Ming Zhu's expression also eased a little. Then he walked forward in silence and went directly into the Jianghu Hall. The others also followed him in. Masato Kihara's expression changed. He slowly walked to Su Qingjuan's side. After a moment of silence, he said to her, "Since you've promised the two immortals, stand guard outside the door. Remember, don't worry about anything else. Just stand there." Su Qingjun was a little surprised and said, "I know. But Master, what happened? Why do I feel that you look a little strange?" Masato Kihara smiled bitterly and said to himself in a low voice, "They are still a little worried about me. What did you say?" Su Qingjun didn't hear clearly and asked. Masato Kihara shook her head and said, "Nothing. But since you've promised Master Mingzhu, then stand here for a while. But remember two things. First, no matter what happens, don't enter the hall, especially the rear hall. That's where the Yuanying immortals gather. Do you understand?" Su Qingjun nodded and said, "Of course, we're not allowed to go to that important place." Spiritual Master Moon smiled, then lowered his voice and said, "Also, you should wait here for an hour at most. After an hour, when it's almost dark, you can leave by yourself. You don't have to stay too long." Su Qingjun was a little surprised. She looked up at Masato Kihara and saw Masato Kihara smiling and saying, "Don't worry, I'll tell them later. It's not a big deal." Su Qingjun was actually still worried about her brother Sumo, who was still in the guest room of Liuxiang Garden. She didn't insist and said, "All right, disciple will obey." At this time, a call came from the front. Masato Kihara glanced at the hall in front of him and said, "Then I'll go. Be careful." Su Qingjun watched Masato Kihara walk into Jianghu Hall. He walked further and further away until he walked into the darkness behind the candlelight, until his figure could no longer be seen. At this moment, the dense forest was already pitch black. Other than the torrential downpour, it was like a cold and deathly silent world. The body of Dukan Jinren, who had died not long ago, had been taken away by Qian Deng and the others. So at this moment, the open space in the forest was empty. There was only dirty water, dirty black mud, and soil mixed with mud and rotten leaves. This forest was unusually quiet and dark. Only the occasional flash of light from the lightning and thunder in the sky could illuminate the scene under the trees for a moment. The cold rain seeped through the soil, making the dark soil feel like an ice cave. The branch hidden under the withered leaves shook a few times in the rain, like a dormant worm about to wake up. Lu Chen, of course, hadn't lost his sober mind. The scene that happened not long ago, that soul-stirring scene, seemed to be unfolding in front of his eyes. Especially when he stabbed Dukan Jinren's lower abdomen. Lu Chen, who was hiding under the ground, received a great shock at that moment. That scene was so familiar. That knife seemed to have awakened the memory that had been sealed for many years. In that instant, he returned to that terrible night many years ago. Even with his calm and perseverance, his breathing was slightly disordered at that moment. Then, when Dukan Jinren fell on the muddy ground before his death, Dukan Jinren discovered that he was lurking here. Lu Chen didn't know what Dukan Jinren was feeling at the last moment of his death. He also didn't know why Dukan Jinren didn't shout out his whereabouts. Perhaps he just deeply hated those who killed him, or perhaps he wanted to frame them. Perhaps he was the spy of the devil cult, who had discovered his companions but refused to sell them out. Or perhaps he was simply at death's door and had no strength to shout out? This sudden massacre, the disaster that arose from the wall, made one's heart turn cold. But in the end, Lu Chen discovered that he was still unable to see clearly who was the evil cult spy who had concealed himself the most. And more importantly, he discovered that the person who had promised him to appear, until now, had still not appeared. Perhaps he should leave now? He pondered silently in the darkness, but at this moment, suddenly, amidst the sound of wind and rain, in this frighteningly cold and dark forest, from one of the gloomy paths in the forest, came a new sound of footsteps. That foot stepped on a small puddle, splashing a bit of water. Then, silently and noiselessly, it continued to approach Lu Chen in the darkness, walking over. The wind and rain became more and more urgent. Chapter 227. The sky darkened. The rumbling of thunder resounded throughout the world, and the frenzied lightning tore through the sky, as if an angry god was roaring in the sky, illuminating the dark Kunlun mountain. Light and shadow intertwined. The light was only for a moment, but the dark shadows seemed to be everywhere, and would continue like this forever. The entire gigantic Kunlun mountain flickered in the storm, lightning, and thunder, except for one place. That was between the clouds and the sky. The 4 strange peaks floating in the sky were majestic and motionless, and in the mysterious forbidden area below them, the thick fog that never dissipated all year round was not affected by the storm at all. All the raindrops fell silently into the thick fog, and there was no longer any movement. The thick fog did not show any signs of shrinking or retreating. Sometimes, this strange thick fog even slowly expanded outwards, slowly drifting towards the 4 strange peaks in the sky. This was the most deserted and empty day of the year in the most important sacred place of the Kunlun party. Because unless they were in closed-door training or could not come out for other reasons, most of the Yuanying Jinren who cultivated between the clouds and the sky would go to Xingyang Hall of Tiankuan Peak. As for the remaining 2 deity transformation stage Jinren Tianlan, he rarely came back, and Hakushin Jinkuan had also left Winter Peak on this day a few years ago to support Jinren Idol Month. The wind and rain were mournful, and the fog was misty. It seemed that no one was paying attention to this place anymore. Only the thick fog kept drifting in the air, looking at the dark night sky. Among the 4 mystical peaks of spring, summer, autumn, and winter, the Winter Peak had always been a very peculiar peak. On this torrential night, the other 3 peaks were drenched by the rain, but the Winter Peak was the only one that didn't have any rain. Because it was too cold on this peak, almost all the raindrops would immediately turn into frost when they fell, and then turn into wind and snow that slowly drifted down. In the world of wind and snow, it was cold and lonely. Transparent icicles of different shapes could be seen everywhere, reflecting each other with a beautiful and psychedelic luster, as if it was a fairyland that was completely different from the outside world. This place was so beautiful, but there was no one around. It seemed like a place where no one should live. Hakushin Jinkuan's Immortal's cave was located at the peak of Winter Peak, surrounded by a violent snowstorm. Legend has it that once a deity transformation stage true monarch, a supreme great cultivator, all of them would possess peerless divine abilities that could penetrate the heavens and the earth, countless marvelous Taoist techniques, and innumerable magical treasures and spirit materials. Furthermore, they would meticulously set up a magical immortal's cave that belonged only to them. Inside, there were all kinds of mystical things, countless formations, the gathering of countless essence from the world, and all kinds of unimaginably fierce restrictive mechanisms. There was even a saying in the cultivation world: never challenge a living soul formation perfected monarch in a perfected monarch's cave abode, even if you were a soul formation perfected monarch. Only dead perfected monarchs of divine transformation realm would have their cave abodes loosened after a long time, allowing outsiders to spy on them. In the long history of the divine central continent, every ancient perfected monarch's cave abode was an inconceivably huge treasure trove. Just a word or two about it was enough to drive the world crazy. Even so, the ancient perfected monarch's cave abodes that had been passed down from ancient times were still extremely dangerous places. Over the years, they had claimed the lives of countless explorers who yearned for treasure. Wuxia stood quietly outside the cave abode on Winter Peak. The wind and snow drifted past and landed on his shoulders, but he seemed to be unaware of it. High above his head was the perfected monarch's cave abode that was wrapped in a violent snowstorm. Occasionally, he would raise his head in the cold wind and glance at the mysterious abode high above. But even with his current Jindan realm eyesight, he was unable to see through the snowstorm, so he couldn't see the appearance of the abode clearly. He had never been to the top of the Winter Peak, and he had never seen the cave mansion before. He had always had a wish in his heart. He wanted to take a look at his master's cave abode, to see for himself whether the cave abode of the most powerful cultivator in the world was really as magical and powerful as the legend said. But, after so many years, he still didn't have this opportunity. But it didn't matter. Wuxia had always been a very patient person. He could wait, and he was willing to wait. Just like now, he was waiting for his master Hakushin Jinkuan to come down from the abode high above. Even if the cold wind hit his face and the ice and snow froze him, he didn't care in the slightest. On the snowy ground beside him, there was a large wooden chest. Sometimes he would glance at it, and then he would look away. The night was deep, and the wind and snow drifted. Suddenly, a whistling sound came from the vault of heaven. In an instant, the sky was filled with wind and snow, swirling up into the air. They gathered at one point and then suddenly dispersed, like a celestial maiden scattering flowers. In the wind and snow, a figure floated down. His appearance was haggard, and his eyes were full of spirit. It was Hakushin Jinkuan. Zhuxian deeply lowered his head. With a respectful expression, he bowed and said, "Shizuan." Hakushin Jinkuan stood with his hands clasped behind his back. With an indifferent expression, he said, "Change your clothes." Zhuxian responded. He turned around and opened the chest beside him. A gust of cold wind blew past, revealing a set of solemn and dignified formal attire in the chest. For many years, wearing formal attire had always been the privilege of the sect leader during the sect council. And as the master of Immortal Idol Month, as long as Hakushin Jinkuan sat there solemnly in this set of attire, there was no need for any words to explain everything. Just as Zhuxian bent over and was about to pick up the formal attire for his master to wear, he suddenly heard Hakushin Jinkuan's question coming from behind him. "Are you the only one on this mountain?" Zhuxian's body suddenly stiffened. His fingers that had just touched the soft formal attire only felt an endless chill suddenly rushing into his body from his fingers, freezing the blood in his entire body. He even subconsciously held his breath. It was pitch black outside the window. Lightning flashed, thunder rumbled, and heavy rain poured down, making people a little flustered. Sitting in front of the window, Exen felt a little uneasy. At this time, a light sound suddenly came from the bed behind her, startling her and causing her to quickly look back. She saw that Sumo, who was lying on the bed, was still unconscious. She just turned over and muttered something, but her expression was actually a little frightened, as if she was dreaming of something terrible. Exen relaxed, but she immediately felt a little funny. Although she was also born in an aristocratic family in Kunwa City, she wasn't familiar with the other members of the Su family except for Su Qingjun, whom she had become close to these days. As for Sumo, she was usually a tyrant in Kunwa City, so she always kept a respectful distance from her. Speaking of today, it was the first time she was alone in a room with this person. She didn't know why, but she always felt a little strange. Therefore, when she saw Sumo turning over in her sleep in fright, Exen didn't go forward to comfort her. At this time, a thought suddenly flashed through her mind. If the person lying on that bed right now was Brother Lu, what would she do? Would she go over and take care of him? Maybe she would. She giggled and suddenly felt her face become a little hot, so she became a little shy and complained in a low voice. It was unknown whether she was talking about herself or cursing Lu Qin. But after standing like this for a while, she still opened the door and walked out. Just like that, she stood in the corridor outside the room. A gust of cold wind mixed with raindrops blew over, blowing against her face. She took a deep breath and suddenly felt a lot more relaxed. Originally, on such a dark day, a girl alone in a room with a strange man didn't look right, so it was better to just stand outside the door. Exen smiled as she looked at the rainy night. The surrounding houses were still deserted, and the people who went to Heavenly Kuan Peak still hadn't returned. On the winter peak amidst the clouds in the sky, Zhuxian slightly bent his body. His fingers touched the dress. In this cold and snowy night, for some reason, a drop of sweat suddenly dripped down his forehead. It was also at this time that the old man standing behind him in the wind and snow said very indifferently, "Where's that girl White Lotus? Where did she go?" Zhuxian closed his eyes and opened them again. In that instant, he took a deep breath and everything returned to normal in the blink of an eye. The smile returned to his face. He reached out and picked up the dress from the big box, spread it out in his hands, and respectfully carried it towards Hakushin Jinkuan. At the same time, he said with a smile, "Little junior sister went down the mountain earlier." Hakushin Jinkuan snorted and said, What's she doing down the mountain instead of cultivating on the mountain? Naughty and mischievous. Zhuxian walked to Hakushin Jinkuin's side, lifted the 2 sleeves of the dress with both hands, and helped Hakushin Jinkuin put it on slowly. At the same time, he said with a smile, although little junior sister's talent is outstanding and rare, she is still a child after all. Sometimes, it's not a big deal to play around a little. After Hakushin Jinkuin put on the dress, he let Zhuxian button up those gorgeous but also very complicated buttons in front of him. At the same time, he frowned and said to him, "You and Idle Month are both her senior brothers. When I'm not around, you should also strictly control White Lotus and not let her loose." Zhuxian nodded and said, "Yes, I understand." As they spoke, the dress was put on. Hakushin Jinkuin shook his sleeves slightly, and the 2 snowflakes beside him turned into a whirlpool. Then, they quietly dispersed and slowly floated down. "Let's go. We'll help your senior brother to hold the fort one last time," Hakushin Jinkuin said lightly, and then his gaze drifted to the distance. In the distance, there was a misty wind and snow, and wisps of mist were floating in the air. "It's very foggy tonight." He sighed and walked forward. However, he had only taken a few steps when his body suddenly stopped. There was silence on Winter Peak. It seemed that even the snowflakes were falling silently, and the whole world was desolate and cold. He slowly turned around and looked in the direction he was just now. The thick mist lingered in the wind and snow, but it did not dissipate. Unknowingly, the mist at the bottom of the 4 strange peaks had spread to the top of Winter Peak. At the same time, at the edge of the wind and snow and the mist, there was a sudden ripple in the mist. An unusually tall and burly figure appeared indistinctly in the mist. Chapter 228. The wind and snow whistled over, but when they reached the edge of the thick fog, they suddenly disappeared. The tall figure in the fog began to walk forward, out of the thick fog, and into the wind and snow. The wide sleeves of the robe, the tall stature, and the eye-catching and famous bald head clearly indicated who this person who had suddenly stepped into the Kunlun Holy Land between the sky and the clouds was. When Hakushin Jinkuin first saw the tall and burly figure, his body trembled slightly. Then, his pupils shrank as he watched the man walk out of the fog. The wind and snow drifted down, but they couldn't get close to his body. Even the night seemed to be a little further away from him. Then, he heard the bald man greet him with a smile. "Hello, senior brother." There was only one person in this world who was qualified to call Hakushin Jinkuin senior brother. That person was also a divine transformation stage perfected cultivator named Tianlan. The initial surprise on Hakushin Jinkuin's face slowly faded, and his expression gradually calmed down. At this time, he even smiled slightly and nodded. "What a rare guest, junior brother." With his hands behind his back, Tianlan casually walked forward. The falling snow silently melted and disappeared a few feet away from him, and there was not the slightest trace of footprints in the snow under his feet. If he hadn't seen this divine transformation stage perfected cultivator in front of him, he might really have thought that he didn't seem to be on Winter Peak. At this moment, this uninvited guest was looking around with some emotion. He looked at the strange snowy peak and said, "Isn't that so? I've never been to Winter Peak before. Actually, let me tell you, senior brother. Back when Master was still here, I wanted to come to Winter Peak to play. In the end, it dragged on until now. I actually haven't come here for so many years." A gloomy look flashed across Bai Chen's face. It was as if Tianlan's words had pierced some unpleasant memory in his heart. He frowned slightly. But very quickly, his gaze moved past Tianlan and landed on the back of the tall figure. On the other side was the mist that Tianlan had just walked out of. It was thick and deep, and at the same time, it could be clearly seen that the thick mist was still slowly rolling and drifting, slowly dispersing on this Winter Peak. Tianlan turned his head and looked at Hakushin Jinkuin, saying, "Why, senior brother, don't you welcome me?" Bai Chen indifferently said, "Aren't you here whether I welcome you or not? What does it matter?" Tianlan laughed and clapped his hands. "You're right." Bai Chen pondered for a moment before she turned her gaze slightly and looked to the other side. On this mountain peak, Apart from the two strongest rulers in Kunlun Mountain, there was a third person, Zhuxian. From the beginning, this second disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan had been standing at the side without saying a word. At this moment, when Hakushin Jinkuan looked over, Zhuxian's face revealed a look of panic as if he wanted to say something to him. Hakushin Jinkuan wanted to say something but hesitated. Then, he shook his head slightly and sighed. Although Zhuxian's dharma was powerful, it was clearly a little difficult for Jin Dan Friar to face a soul formation perfected lord and ask his senses to detect the other party's traces. Hence, he waved his hand slightly at Zhuxian, signaling him to step aside. Then, he turned to face Tianlan. His expression became serious as he looked at his powerful and terrifying junior brother. "All right, tell me, what do you want to do by coming here today?" Tianlan smiled. His expression was gentle, and he even reached out to touch his bald head, looking a little embarrassed. He said to Perfected Lord Bai Chen with a smile, "Senior brother, back then, Master told me that he wanted to give this winter peak to me, and I really like this place very much. That's why I wanted to say this today. Why don't you give this winter peak to me?" He said with a smile. Tinkuan Peak, at the back of Jianghu Hall. Immortal Idol Month, who was still wearing a formal and solemn gown, sat in the side hall of the back hall, looking very dignified. At this moment, people were coming to the side hall one after another. Those who could come here were, of course, the highly respected Yuanying Immortal of the Kunlun party. 2 rows of big chairs were lined up, but there were 2 main seats in the middle. Immortal Idol Month sat on one of them, and slightly behind him, there was another empty big chair, but at this moment, no one was sitting on it. Those who came would often look at the empty chair, and then return to their seats with a complicated expression, remaining silent. Dongfang Tao's seat was the last chair on the right side of this side hall. After coming in and greeting Immortal Idol Month, he sat here. At this moment, his expression also looked a little complicated. Occasionally, he would look up at Immortal Idol Month, and then quickly his eyes fell on several immortal Yuanying immortals sitting on the other side. They were led by Qian Deng, Ming Zhu, and the others. Unlike the others who were scattered, Qian Deng, Ming Zhu, Guangyang, and the others were clearly gathered together. But the most surprising thing was the fourth person walking behind Qian Deng and the others. He was Masato Kihara, and also the leader of the Iron Branch of the Kunlun Party. In many cases, Masato Kihara's attitude was equal to the attitude of the only 4 Yuanying immortals in the Iron Branch. When he saw Muyuan Jinren, who had been living a detached life away from worldly affairs, suddenly walk over and sit down in front of Thousand Lanterns Jinren, Idol Moon Jinren's face turned ugly for the first time. After a while, seeing that the number of people in this side hall was quite large, roughly more than 10 people, Qian Deng stood up and said to Immortal Idol Month, "Sect Master, I think there are enough people, should we start?" Immortal Idol Month snorted but coldly said, "There are still a few people who haven't come yet, let's wait for a while." Qian Deng did not refute, only nodded, and after responding he sat back down again. At that moment, almost all of the Yuanying immortals in this side hall had their eyes on the chair behind Immortal Idol Month. Why hasn't he come yet? Of course, Immortal Idol Month could also feel the strange expressions of the Yuanying immortals, but his expression did not change in the slightest, as if he had a well-thought-out plan. He only smiled faintly. On the contrary, Thousand Lanterns Mingyue and the others wore solemn expressions as they waited quietly. Outside the Jianghu Hall, Su Qingjun stood quietly. At this time, many of the disciples who participated in the daytime meeting had almost all left, and even the original Taoist children in the Jianghu Hall, probably because the night was too dark and there was too much wind and rain, so no one appeared here. Unconsciously, Su Qingjun found that in the large space in front of the Jianghu Hall, she was the only one left. The night was mournful and cold, and the wind and rain were still falling without any signs of stopping. There was no one around, and the sky was also dark. Only a faint candlelight from the Jianghu Hall illuminated a small area. Su Qingjun looked at the sky, and for a moment, she could not tell the time, but she felt that it was about half an hour, but there was no movement in the Jianghu Hall. After pondering for a while, she still decided to wait a little longer. At this moment, she suddenly heard a sound of footsteps coming from the wind and rain in front of her. Su Qingjun looked up, only to see that the sky was too dark, and in the cold wind and rain, it was difficult to see clearly. She could only vaguely see the vague figure of a man, slowly walking over. Her heart suddenly felt a little nervous, and she reached behind her, holding the scabbard of the long sword. That figure gradually walked closer, all the way to the front of the hall, and then walked up the steps. Su Qingjun was suddenly startled, because she knew this person. It was he. Different from the handsome and elegant appearance of the past, at this moment, he walking in the wind and rain didn't look quite right. His face seemed to have a trace of deep exhaustion, and his clothes were somewhat messy. Of course, walking in the rain without an umbrella, it was normal to suffer a little. Under the eaves in front of the hall, the man and the woman looked at each other, each with a bit of vigilance, but after a moment, he was the first to speak and greeted Su Qingjun. "Junior sister Su." He faintly called out to her. Su Qingjun nodded and said, "It's so late, senior brother, you still came here, is there something?" Her attitude was not stiff, but her tone was still a bit cold, as if she still remembered Sumo's injury. He asked, "Aren't you also here?" Su Qingjun said, "I want to wait for my master Masato Kihara." "Senior brother are you also waiting for that Dukanjinren?" After saying that, she thought for a moment and said, "Oh yes, I don't think I saw him this afternoon." He smiled and said, "Yes, my master is always elusive, so I'd better wait for him here." Saying that, he looked around, and then, unexpectedly unafraid of the wet and dirty, directly sat on the stone steps not far from him. One must know, the previous storm was so strong, and the stone steps had long been wet. Su Qingjun frowned, and took 2 steps to the side, as if intentionally or unintentionally distancing herself from he. Some words, no one said it out, but they could all feel the alienation and a trace of hostility in each other's eyes. Just like that, not knowing how long, he suddenly opened his mouth and said, "This night is so windy and rainy, when exactly will the sun rise?" Su Qingjun looked at him, her expression indifferent, and replied, "It's still early." He smiled bitterly, turned his head to look at the dark night sky full of wind and rain, and was lost in thought. Even if the rain dripped on his body, he didn't care. Su Qingjun snorted, after struggling in her heart for a few times. Finally her face sank and walked forward, directly into the wind and rain, and then left Zhengyang Hall. Chapter 229. Boom! There was an explosion of thunder in the sky. At that moment, the dark clouds in the sky seemed to be boiling. More than a dozen bolts of lightning appeared at the same time and spread wildly in all directions. The wind howled and the wind and rain howled. The entire sky seemed to be enraged and entered a state of complete madness in this dark night. The power was so great that even the winter peak, which was protected by a tight tactical formation, could feel it even though the wind and snow were not the same as the outside world all year round. The wind and snow in the sky blew faster and faster. The wind howled shrilly, wrapping around the 2 figures who were faintly confronting each other in the mountain. However, only the thick fog behind perfected Lord Tunlan still gathered and did not disperse. It seemed to be indifferent to the storm and snow. "You want my winter peak?" Hakushin Jinkuin stared at Tianlan and asked calmly. But for some reason, under his calm tone, every word seemed to have a strange power, urging the wind and snow to sweep over from every corner of the sky. They began to slowly gather above his head, like a throne of ice and snow, or a giant in the wind and snow. The cold and murderous air, like the coldness of the sky, spread quietly in the wind and snow without mercy. Tianlan also did not have any intention of avoiding his gaze. He looked at Hakushin Jinkuin, and the smile on his face disappeared. "Is it yours?" He stared at the skinny old man, his loose robe fluttering in the wind. His eyes were as sharp as a knife, as if he wanted to stab into Hakushin Jinkuin's chest and see the old man's heart. "No way! Since when can things that are stolen belong to oneself?" The world suddenly turned cold and no one spoke anymore. That was because they had nothing else to say. The two simple sentences from before had sealed off all their paths of retreat. This pair of brothers who had lived for a long time had finally reached this day. Finally, there was no way out for them. Wuxia subconsciously stepped back. The wind and snow were too strong, and the cold wind was too fast and too cold. When it whistled past the mountain peak, even with his cultivation, Jean Dan Fryer felt a little frightened. The two figures in the wind and snow in front of him looked so terrifying. Such a terrible storm seemed to only wrap around the two of them. It was the power of heaven and earth that they controlled. After a while, Wuxia suddenly felt a chill on his back. He had already touched a mountain wall. The hard ice adhered to the stone wall, emitting traces of coldness. He realized that at this point he actually had no way out. His heart beat violently. He looked up at the two figures in front of him, who were starting to blur in the violent wind and snow. He suddenly gasped. The two people stood in the wind and snow, one tall and one short, one big and one small. One big and one small. One big and one small. One big and one big. One big and one big and one big. Bai Chen looked at Tianlan with a complicated expression in his eyes. However, his expression was solemn and did not show the slightest fear or timidity. The strong wind blew from behind him. That solemn and magnificent robe fluttered, as if he had lived a glorious life. He stretched out a hand. His somewhat shriveled palm was facing the sky. The sound of the wind and snow suddenly became several times louder, and even the entire winter peak seemed to faintly resonate with it. Countless white snowflakes whizzed in from all directions, desperately rushing into the faintly forming huge white shadow. The snow wind giant, towering between the heavens and the earth, appeared on top of the skinny old man's head and let out an earth-shaking roar towards the dark sky. The wind and clouds in the sky rolled and thunder rumbled. After a while, a huge fist descended from the sky. It made an ear-piercing whistling sound in the air and smashed towards True Lord Tianlan. Before the fist of ice and snow arrived, the ground beneath their feet had already begun to tremble. Even the fog that had been indifferent to the wind and snow all this while had actually retreated a few feet in an instant. The ferocity of the attack was evident. True Lord Tianlan's expression was solemn. He took a step back and made a circle with his hands. In an instant, his wide robe suddenly fluttered like the wind and a surge of energy burst forth. The dense fog behind him suddenly rolled. Immediately after, a mist giant with half a body appeared from the fog. It roared and pounced towards the snow wind giant. Boom! A low and loud rumble came from the sky. The ground under his feet trembled violently. The entire winter peak that was floating in the sky also shook twice. Cracking sounds could be heard. Countless cracks instantly appeared. That was the sound of 10,000-year-old ice cracking. The two giants retreated a certain distance. They seemed to have been injured by the terrifying force just now. However, very quickly, they continued to pounce forward and collided with each other in the blink of an eye. The heaven and the earth shook, and the wind and snow roared. At that moment, on the winter peak, a naked, terrifying power was displayed. There were no tricks, no subtleties. Only for the most powerful semi-divinity realm human beings, this was the kind of pure power that returned to the natural state. All the Tao techniques and divine arts in the world that could be imagined or unimaginable or ingenious had completely disappeared at this moment. They were discarded by these two peak cultivators without any hesitation. For a moment, Wuxia, who was the only person in the world to witness this battle between divine transformation realm true lords, even had an illusion. He felt that the battle between the two giants in the sky was like a fight between two toddling babies. It was a simple and pure fight. Their movements were even a little slow. Everything seemed clumsy in the eyes of the cultivators in the world. The only thing that stood out from the rest was their terrifying power. With a punch, the heaven and earth changed color and the wind and clouds rolled. With a roar, the mountains and rivers flowed backward and the wind and snow surged. Lightning rolled down from the dark clouds and wrapped around the two terrifying giants. The electric currents darted around like strange silver snakes, but they still could not stop the two giants from fighting. Under the whistling wind and snow, Bai Chen and Tianlan were silent. Their breathing gradually became heavier, but neither of them had the slightest intention of backing down. However, as the fierce battle continued, their bodies also began to change. According to the legends, the body of a supreme was as strong as the body of a god. However, at this moment in the wind and snow, cracks began to appear on his body, just like the ice that had been frozen for tens of thousands of years and was once extremely hard. A piece of their sleeves was torn apart, and a piece of flesh exploded. Low and deep white smoke rose up and down, slowly drifting up from their bodies. Every time they shot up a white mist, their bodies would tremble, and the ground under their feet and the sky above their heads were like mountains collapsing and the wind and clouds rolling, forming a huge vortex, crazily swallowing the endless wind and snow, and then dissipating in this crazy world. Boom! After countless collisions, the beautiful snowy scenery on the winter peak was already a mess. The lightning that fell from the sky had already wrapped the entire winter peak together. It was as if doomsday had arrived. Countless silver chains descended and bound this terrifying place, about to be thrown into the burning and boiling underworld. Looking from high above the clouds, the mountains seemed to have a strange sense of beauty. Outside the clouds, the boundless thick fog had quietly surrounded the entire winter peak, completely covering this earth-shattering scene. In this fierce battle that shook the heavens and earth, the two figures that were facing each other suddenly trembled for a moment. A moment later, Hakushin Jinkuin suddenly let out an angry roar in the snowstorm. He raised his head. His face, which had always been indifferent even when he had countless hidden injuries on his body, suddenly flashed with a trace of disbelief and shock. Above his head, the incomparably powerful snow wind giant that seemed to be the ruler of heaven and earth suddenly slowed down. At the same time, the mist giant that was in front of it suddenly swung its fist. Passing through the snowstorm and lightning, accompanied by the sudden explosion of thunder in the sky, the fist landed on the snow wind giant's chest. The heavens and earth suddenly froze at that moment. The fist smashed through all the wind and frost, smashed through the unchanging power of dozens of years, smashed through the snowstorm, and pierced through the chest. The snow wind giant let out an earth-shattering roar. As if it was filled with unwillingness, it turned into fragments, filling the sky with snowflakes, and fell down from the sky. On the ground, Hakushin Jinkuin's body violently trembled, then he spat out a mouthful of blood. The blood was black. When the black blood fell on the snowy ground, it instantly burned the surroundings. The snowy ground immediately sank, and a deep hole several feet wide appeared on the snowy ground. Hissing sounds could be heard, but strangely, there wasn't a terrifying stench in the air. Instead, there was a faint fragrance. Hakushin Jinkuin's pupils contracted for a moment. Staring at the pool of black blood on the ground, there was an uncontrollable shock in his eyes. Then, as if he suddenly thought of something, he lowered his head and looked at his own body. His skinny, old, but once powerful body was filled with scars at this moment. However, in the snowstorm, he was still solemn and dignified, like a gown that fluttered in the wind and snow. There was also a faint fragrance that was only diffusing at this moment. Hakushin Jinkuin grabbed his clothes with his 5 fingers, and with a casual tug, the entire gown instantly turned into pieces. However, at the same time, his body swayed a bit, and he spat out another mouthful of blood. Similarly, it was black. In the air, the giant formed from the mist had unknowingly dissipated, and once again became a part of the thick mist. Similarly, Tenlun, who was covered in cuts and bruises but clearly had a resolute expression, stood in the snowstorm that had once again quietened down, and quietly looked at the old man in front of him. "Good move." A low voice sounded from the snowstorm in front of them. Hakushin Jinkuin raised his head, looked at his junior brother, and said, "What poison is this, to actually be able to injure our soul transformation stage bodies?" "Black dragon saliva," True Lord Tianlon said. Then he clutched his chest, and a pained expression appeared on his face as he coughed a few times. Chapter 230. The heavy rain poured down, and the dense forest was pitch black. Water flowed down like a waterfall everywhere, and the sound of the rushing water seemed to have covered all other sounds. However, in such a pitch-black forest, there was still a figure traversing in the darkness. He walked past one tree after another that was as dark as a ghost, stepped over one damp puddle after another, and gradually approached the empty space in the middle of the forest. There was no one on the ground, only damp water mixed with black mud and dried leaves. That black figure hid behind a large tree, very cautiously looking towards the tree next to the large rock. After waiting for a long time, he found that there was still no movement. The black figure was a bit hesitant, but in the end still slowly and tentatively walked forward. The rainwater was blocked by a layer of dense branches and leaves. Landing on the black figure's body was already silent. Even when this black figure walked to the center of the clearing, nothing happened. This fact seemed to make the black figure a bit stunned and shocked. He turned his body and carefully looked around, but found that this forest was almost completely dark. Those shadows that trembled intensely in the wind and rain looked abnormally eerie and terrifying, but if one looked carefully, they would see that most of them were tree branches and leaves swaying in the wind. The air was filled with a cold aura in this lonely and dark forest. The black figure took a step back, as if he didn't like this place, then turned around, looking like he was going to walk away. However, at this time, suddenly he only felt his feet tighten, a hand like a ghost claw suddenly reaching out from the mud under his feet, suddenly rushing out, grabbing the black figure's ankle. Ah! A short and sharp cry suddenly pierced through the silence of the dark forest. In this gloomy rainy night, something like a hand suddenly reaching out from the ground, this kind of thing, it really was too creepy. Even though the black figure had seen many evil things in the past that could challenge the limits of ordinary people, at this moment he still couldn't help but shiver, involuntarily crying out. That short and sharp voice, it was actually a woman. This sudden sound, the hand underground also seemed to be startled. The originally murderous hand gesture also paused for a moment. In the time it takes for a spark to fly off a flint, the black shadow quickly calmed down. With a light shout, he stomped heavily on the ground. Immediately after, a sharp icicle appeared in his hand and pierced into the soil, intending to pierce through the person in the soil. But what welcomed her was a large handful of darkness, accompanied by a roar. A large amount of dirty black soil and a large amount of water suddenly surged up from the ground, covering the sky and covering the earth, directly rushing to the side. The black figure screamed, in an instant disregarding everything, directly retreating. But behind the black soil, a figure suddenly leaped out from the soil. It was Lu Chen. Like a cheetah, he pounced towards the black figure. He moved later, but arrived first. In an instant he grabbed the black figure's body, and with his right hand he locked her slender neck. That black figure's head suddenly raised, one hand grabbing onto Lu Chen's fierce arm, the lower leg instead silently kicked out. After a moment, only a pung sound was heard, directly hitting on Lu Chen's lower abdomen. Lu Chen grunted, and his face instantly paled in the darkness. However, his toughness and tenacity were completely displayed at this moment. He gritted his teeth and endured the pain of this kick. Then his arm tightened, and the black fire in the depths of his eyes suddenly blazed. It directly pressed down on the arm, and only after it pressed down hard on the neck was there heard. There was only a painful grunt, and the black figure's body immediately went limp. And at this moment, only a shocking thunder was heard in the sky, as if in the distant horizon there was a terrifying and powerful impact bursting out. At the same time, a bolt of lightning suddenly split the sky, illuminating the world. In the middle of the forest, that bolt of lightning similarly illuminated the darkness here for a moment. The heavy rain poured down. In the drizzling water, Lu Chen saw that person close at hand. That was White Lotus. White Lotus's face was extremely pale, seemed to have been injured in that short but intense fight just now, but her mind was still clear. Right now her eyes were opened, similarly saw Lu Chen, that pale-faced man covered in mud and water. Therefore, at the same time, she was also stunned. The lightning disappeared from the sky, so darkness once again returned to this part of the forest. Heavy rain poured down, the violent wind blowing the leaves and branches incessantly whistling. In the dark forest, the man and woman who were still entangled together and fighting each other were in a deadlock. In the darkness, they seemed to be able to hear each other's breathing. After a moment, Lu Chen felt a light and slightly probing force from his hand, as if it wanted to push his hand away. He was silent, but after a moment he still slowly let go of his hand. At the same time, in the darkness, White Lotus also slowly withdrew her other hand hidden in the darkness. Just a little bit more, her hand would be able to touch Lu Chen's flesh and blood. A faint light flashed in the darkness, then disappeared. A moment later, in the darkness, the two of them suddenly spoke in unison. "So it's you!" Between the clouds and the sky, on the winter peak. In this cold world, there was still snow and frost falling, but in the falling snow, there was suddenly a strange moist thing, that was strands of rain. Rain from the sky. This was perhaps the first time in a long time that rain had passed through the snow and landed on the winter peak. Hakushin Jinkuen, who was standing in the snow and vomiting black blood, raised his head to look at the sky above the winter peak, his eyes a little disappointed. In the sky, lightning raged and thunder rumbled, as if the heavens were showing unprecedented anger, venting its terrible power on this mountain peak. Perfected Lord Bai Chen retracted his gaze and turned his head. However, he didn't speak to his number one enemy, Perfected Lord Tianlun. Instead, he looked at Zhuxian, who had been standing silently by the side the entire time. Zhuxian, who was leaning against the ice wall, looked abnormally pale, as if witnessing the soul-stirring battle between perfected lords was a great burden to him. Jin Dan Friar. At the same time, the originally incomparably hard ice wall behind him had more than a dozen cracks of various sizes, and from time to time, ice shards would fall. Some of the ice shards fell directly on Zhuxian's head, but he did not dodge and stood motionless like a piece of wood. This was because Hakushin Jinkuen's gaze was fixed on him. "Why?" Perfected Lord Bai Chen asked him. There was not much fury or hatred in his eyes. Instead, there seemed to be more confusion and confusion. Zhuxian lowered his head slightly, and after a while he said, "I'm sorry, master." Hakushin Jinkuen shook his head, frowned, and vomited another mouthful of black blood. However, for some reason after the black blood left his mouth, his originally black aura shrouding his exhausted face actually looked a little better. Then he looked at Zhuxian and repeated, "Why?" Zhuxian was silent, then took a deep breath and said, "I can't accept it." "What can't you accept?" Hakushin Jinkuen stared at him, then coughed painfully and said, "You're also at this age now, what do you not have? What is there to be unwilling about?" Zhuxian shook his head and said, "There's everything, it's you and senior brother, not me." Hakushin Jinkuen smiled bitterly. Suddenly his body trembled and he vomited another mouthful of black blood. Then he took a deep breath, his eyes brightened a little, stared at Zhuxian and said, "I didn't expect that you didn't say a word all these years, so it's because you're dissatisfied." Zhuxian said, "That's because you've never valued me. The successor is eldest brother, and the position of the head is eldest brother. All the mystical materials, resources, cultivation methods, and the best ones are eldest brothers. I can only follow eldest brother forever. That's why he's a Yuanying realm cultivator and I'm just a Jindan realm cultivator." Hakushin Jinkuen shook his head, disappointment on his face, said in a low voice, "I didn't expect you to be so muddle-headed." Zhuxian said, "You said it just now, I'm also old now. If I don't fight for it, I'll be like this for the rest of my life, but I don't want to be like this." Hakushin Jinkuen sneered and said, "How ambitious. Come, tell me what kind of great benefits can this remarkable junior brother of mine give you? Is it enough for you to betray me and plot against me?" Zhuxian was about to speak, but suddenly, the deep voice of perfected Lord Tianlun floated over in the wind and snow, saying indifferently, "I promised him a future of Yuanying Jinren." Hakushin Jinkuen suddenly turned around and stared at Tianlun for a moment, then with a disdainful face, he sneered at Zhuxian and said, "You actually believe this kind of nonsense that can fool a child? Since ancient times, have you ever heard of any method that can let someone rise from Jindan to Yuanying? That's a great life or death juncture, who can avoid it?" He looked at Wuxia. There was no murderous intent on his face, only deep disappointment. He said, "I've taught you for decades, but I didn't expect that I've taught you such an idiot." Wuxia did not say anything, but perfected Lord Tianlan took a step forward and said, "Senior brother, you're old. There are many things in this world that you don't know. You're just a frog at the bottom of a well." Hakushin Jinkuan's haggard face suddenly frowned, and with a sound, he vomited a large mouthful of black blood. But strangely, after vomiting blood this time, his face actually quickly became ruddy, and he looked even more spirited than usual. Wind, frost, rain, and snow unknowingly gathered above his head again. This old divine transformation realm perfected Lord slowly straightened his body, and a majestic and powerful aura that had never been seen before slowly flowed out from his body. "Oh, a frog at the bottom of a well?" He laughed, then looked at perfected Lord Tianlan, looked at Wuxia, looked at the thick fog, and then looked at the deep night sky. "Even if you're a frog, I can also eat you," he said indifferently. Chapter 231. The wind and rain met the peak of the mountain, and lightning shone on the black dog. The highest point of this nameless mountain was a long and narrow slope at the top of the mountain. A large stone stood there abruptly, about 7 or 8 feet from the ground. Standing on this large stone, it was as if standing on the highest point of the mountain, overlooking the surrounding wilderness. However, in this stormy night, there was no longer any scenery around this large stone. There was only the smell of blood that even the wind and rain could not blow away. The corpses that littered the ground and the blood that flowed everywhere were telling of everything that had happened here. In this stormy night, this barbaric and tragic story that was outside the sight of humans was told. The black dog was still alive. It was still breathing. It was still standing on the highest point of the large stone. At its feet, there were badly mutilated corpses everywhere. Those demon beasts that coveted its flesh and blood had already been drained of their own blood. Their corpses covered the long and narrow slope of the mountain. In the distance, there were not many terrifying auras left. There were not many, but there were still some. On this night, the impulsive demonic beasts had all died. The demonic beasts that were not strong enough had all died. The demonic beasts that were not cunning enough had all died. The demonic beasts that were not brave enough had all run away. Behind the thick and nauseating stench of blood, under the illumination of the occasional flashes of lightning, one could still vaguely see that behind the slope, there were still 2 remaining gazes coldly staring at Big Rock's direction. They lingered around, still coveting the delicious flesh and blood. The heavy rain continued to fall, hitting the body of Atsu on the large stone. At this moment, there was not a single intact piece of flesh on its body. There were wounds and bloodstains everywhere. It looked like its own blood was about to run dry. However, Atsu still did not fall. It was like a lonely but paranoid mad dog, gritting its teeth as it stood on the large stone, coldly scanning the dark world. But at the same time, at the moment when the lightning flashed, even it and the remaining 2 cold gazes beside it felt the black dog's body tremble and saw that it was on the verge of collapse. Perhaps in the next moment, the black dog would fall from the boulder and die on the spot, so the 2 eyes hidden in the darkness were still quietly waiting for the unusually fierce black dog to end its own life. In any case, how could there be a bright moon on such a stormy night? Without the power of the full moon, no matter how powerful a holy beast was, it would be impossible for it to become a holy beast. The black dog undoubtedly knew this as well. Perhaps no one had ever told it, but when the monster blood in its body stimulated its instincts, it also understood this rule. The wind and rain were too strong, so it was impossible for the moon to appear. But at this point, there was already no way out for it. Atsu slowly crouched down. Surrounded by bloody corpses at the highest point of the hill, he raised his head and looked at the sky. Other than the desolate wind and rain, there were only layers of thick, dark clouds. There was no sign of the moon. A soft whimper came from its mouth and it lowered its head, as if at this last moment, it finally had to admit defeat to its fate. Darkness surged, and the black dog's figure on the highest point of the hill looked so lonely. At the foot of the hill in the distance, Two cold and gloomy voices slowly rose to their feet, as if they had finally waited for the best opportunity, and they began to walk towards the top of the hill. The atmosphere on Winter Peak suddenly became a little strange. Although the wind and snow were still dancing, and although there were still lightning flashing and thunder rumbling in the sky, the temperature on the snowy ground by the cliff was dropping rapidly. The falling snowflakes were getting heavier and heavier, and the atmosphere between heaven and earth was cold and somber. Occasionally, when one raised his head to look at the peak of the hill, he would notice that the violent snowstorm that had enveloped the top of the hill had suddenly left the peak and began to slowly move downwards, gradually approaching the two people who were facing off against each other. Hakushin Jinkuin stood in the snow and stared at Tianlun, saying word by word, "You actually dared to come to this Winter Peak to challenge me. This is the stupidest thing you've ever done." Perfected Lord Tianlun also raised his head to look at the slowly falling snowstorm. A moment later, he smiled and looked at Hakushin Jinkuin, his eyes slightly narrowed. "Is that so?" Hakushin Jinkuin snorted coldly. "Before Master died, he told me that you're arrogant and bold, and if you achieve great success in Taoism in the future, the disaster you'll cause would probably be far worse than the Three Realms Fiend cult. Today, it seems that it's true." His gaze was like lightning as he stared coldly at Tianlun and said coldly, "How dare you go to the underground palace and steal the black dragon's saliva that was born from that fiend?" Perfected Lord Tianlun laughed. "Oh, did Master say that, or did you say that yourself?" Bai Chen's expression was cold as she said, "Those of us who know the cause and effect of that case back then naturally know what happened. I only have one thing to say, I have a clear conscience." "What a coincidence!" Perfected Lord Tianlun took a step forward and said indifferently, "When I went to visit Master's grave yesterday, I also said those words in front of his grave. I have a clear conscience." He enunciated each word clearly, his voice rumbling like thunder. Hakushin Jinkuin didn't say anything else, but before he really made a move, he deliberately turned to look at Zhuxian who was standing at the side. There was no expression on his face, but his eyes were colder than the snow in the sky. Although he didn't say anything, the coldness in his eyes was very clear and obvious. Zhuxian understood his master's meaning. His face quickly turned pale. At the same time, he also discovered that as the snowstorm descended and the temperature of the snowy ground around him plummeted, the ice wall behind him, which had almost shattered into pieces, suddenly began to solidify again. The snowstorm grew stronger, and his body became colder. Perfected Lord Tianlun remained motionless because none of the snowstorm could approach his body. All he did was calmly watch the falling snowstorm. Moments later, he suddenly sensed something and looked down at his feet. It was a snowy land that was covered in a thick layer of snow. But at this moment, a faint tremor suddenly came from the depths of the ground beneath their feet. It was as though a wave was rising from the depths of this massive mountain and spreading out like a ripple. The thick layer of snow on the snowy ground suddenly trembled. Countless soft snowflakes bounced up slightly. Then, it happened a second time, a third time, each time more obvious and more intense than the last. Then, everyone felt that it was the Winter Peak that was trembling, the mountain peak that was roaring. Whoosh! Hakushin Jinkuin fluttered his clothes and flew into the air. At the same time, the snowstorm in the sky descended like a snow-white and violent ring, wrapping around Hakushin Jinkuin like a king of ice and snow. With Hakushin Jinkuin at the center, it formed a huge snowball that danced violently in the air. The Winter Peak was shaking more and more violently. Countless pieces of ice and snow flew up and surged towards the huge snowball from all directions. The wind was shrill and sharp, almost like a knife, cutting through the hard ice on the mountain walls along the way. The skinny but godlike old man was hidden in the huge snowball with unparalleled power. His voice was like the howl of the snowstorm, resounding between heaven and earth. "You shouldn't have come here," he said coldly. Then he raised his hand and pointed. The place where he pointed and the direction in which he pointed suddenly froze. Be it the drifting snowflakes or the blowing wind, everything froze into ice. Then, there was a cracking sound like a sharp blade that pierced through the void and swiftly formed a sharp thorn in the air. Then, the snowstorm suddenly became louder and expanded from the original snowball by several times. In the air, a similar thorn appeared around the icicle thorn. Then, as if it was spreading, countless icicles appeared in an instant, covering the sky and the earth. Tens of thousands of icicles surrounded perfected Lord Tianlan from all directions. The icicle's tip flickered with a faint, transparent light and was filled with killing intent. Zhuxian, who was hiding at the side, suddenly revealed a look of despair. He thought that he had valued his old master enough, but it was not until today that he truly realized that the power of a divine transformation stage perfected lord was far beyond what he could covet. He had yet to witness his master's true power. However, perhaps because of this, Zhuxian's eyes soon burned with the flames of anger, jealousy, and indignation. He had never known such a powerful realm and such terrifying power, but his eldest senior brother definitely knew. Even his junior sister, White Lotus, who had just entered the sect not long ago, had been directly taught the secret technique of the snow scripture by their master at a young age. Given time, she would definitely know about this terrifying Taoist technique as well. He was the only one who didn't know anything. Compared to Zhuxian, who had lost his composure, Tianlan, who was a divine transformation stage perfected lord of the same realm as Bai Chen, was clearly much calmer than Zhuxian. Even though he was surrounded by tens of thousands of sharp icicles and was in danger of being pierced through the next moment, Tianlan's expression did not reveal too much worry. He even looked at Hakushin Jinkuan, who was floating in the huge snowball, from afar. After a while, he grinned and said, "Even I have to admire you for guiding the chi of the strange spirit vein and forcefully seizing the mysterious ice formation for your own use. I really have to say that you're amazing to be able to do all this." He shook his head and sighed. There seemed to be a hint of admiration on his face, but very soon, perfected Lord Tianlan smiled faintly again. This time, there was a hint of mockery. "Are you going to fight me to the death, senior brother?" Chapter 232. Hakushin Jinkuan didn't mind perfected Lord Tianlan's slightly sarcastic tone. Those who could cultivate to the highest realm in the world and stand at the pinnacle of the human race's martial strength had all tempered their will to be as tough as steel in the long process of cultivation. However, confidence and pride didn't equate to stupidity and blindness. The person in front of him was his junior brother and also a talented perfected lord of the divine transformation realm. Bai Chen definitely didn't think that Tianlan was someone who could be easily dealt with. Furthermore, the current situation was obviously the result of Tianlan's sudden intrusion into Winter Peak after careful planning. Putting everything else aside, just the fact that his second disciple, Zhuxian, had betrayed him showed how dangerous the situation was. Bai Chen even began to worry about the situation below Winter Peak. Today was the day the sect council would be held. According to the plan, the eldest disciple, Idle Month, should be in Tiankuan Peak's Jingyang Hall having a meeting with the various elites in the sect. During the most important night meeting, he might still be waiting for her to go over and hold the fort. However, Tianlan suddenly came and blocked him on the Winter Peak. Hakushin Jinkuan could easily imagine that there must be some conspiracy behind this. However, at this moment, he couldn't quickly contact his eldest disciple. Therefore, the best and most effective way was to quickly settle the matter in front of him. In fact, the fight at the foot of the mountain wasn't a big deal. It was nothing more than some intrigue and murder. Even if it was murder, how many people could they kill? Could they turn the world upside down? What mattered was that junior brother Tianlan in front of him was the only person who could truly threaten him. As long as he could win here, what couldn't he clean up? True Lord Bai Chen's mind spun to this point, but it only took a moment for him to clearly understand the importance of this chaotic situation. His gaze became even colder as he stared at the bald and burly man below and said coldly, "Junior brother, on account of Master's warning before his death, I can spare you this time. As long as you hand over that traitorous disciple, Zhuxian, to me to deal with and retreat from Winter Peak, I'll treat it as if today's matter never happened. Otherwise..." At this point, Hakushin Jinkuan sneered and glanced at the transparent thorns that filled the sky with cold light. "Don't forget, This is Winter Peak, the cave abode that I've managed for many years. It won't be difficult for me to take your life." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked up at the figure wrapped in the snowstorm and didn't speak immediately. Instead, he stared thoughtfully for a moment. Then, he suddenly sensed something and turned to look at Zhuoxian under the ice wall. Zhuoxian's face was as pale as a piece of paper. His chest rose and fell and his breathing seemed to become rapid. Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed heartily and waved his hand at him. Then, he pointed at the figure in the snowstorm and said, "Don't be afraid, don't be afraid. He's just scaring people." The snowstorm suddenly became urgent and the whistling sound became louder. It seemed that his words had angered Hakushin Jinkuin in the snowstorm. However, Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't seem to care. He squinted slightly and looked at Hakushin Jinkuin for a moment. He smiled and said, "Senior brother, I wasn't so sure at first. But after hearing what you said, I probably know that the black dragon saliva is not easy to bear. It's not so easy to detoxify it by spitting out 2 mouthfuls of blood, right?" Hakushin Jinkuin sneered and didn't say anything else. He controlled the snowstorm to descend slowly and the sharp spikes in the sky began to tremble slightly. It was as though the final battle had arrived and the next moment, thousands of arrows were going to shoot and poke Perfected Lord Tianlan into a sieve. Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to have sensed Hakushin Jinkuin's determination. He nodded and the smile on his face disappeared. It was unknown which crystal-clear icicle suddenly vibrated and let out a sound. All of a sudden, this pleasing sound with a hint of coldness rang out. Countless icicles began to move, sealing off all of Perfected Lord Tianlan's escape routes. Seeing that a huge battle was about to break out, Zhuoxian, who was watching from the side, subconsciously held his breath. However, at that moment, Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly stomped his foot. That foot stepped into the snowy ground, passing through the snowflakes and landing on the solid ground. In an instant, it was as though the mountains were shaking and the earth was cracking. A huge hole suddenly appeared where Perfected Lord Tianlan was standing. Then, Perfected Lord Tianlan's burly figure fell into the hole and disappeared in an instant. In mid-air, Hakushin Jinkuin let out a furious roar. The snowstorm roared and countless transparent sharp spikes came crashing down. In the blink of an eye, the snowy ground was riddled with holes. Not only the snowy ground, even the soil layer was pierced by these powerful ice spikes. However, Perfected Lord Tianlan had actually disappeared. After a while, the winter peak suddenly shook again. Under the snowstorm where Hakushin Jinkuin was, a large cloud of snowflakes exploded and a figure soared into the sky. With a deafening whistle, he charged into the snowstorm from below. Soon after, hundreds of sharp ice spikes rushed out from the ground and chased after Perfected Lord Tianlan's body as if they were hunting for his life. They also charged into the snowstorm. Like the rumbling of thunder, all kinds of strange sounds came from the snowstorm. After a while, lightning suddenly appeared and shuttled through the snowstorm. At the same time, the wind's speed became faster and faster, so much so that people could not see what was happening in the snowstorm. Suddenly, a loud roar exploded from the depths of the snowstorm. The lightning suddenly became more than 10 times brighter and rushed in all directions. Countless snowflakes and ice blocks also exploded, destroying everything in the vicinity of the snowstorm. The mountain walls collapsed and the snowdrifts collapsed. Countless white snow fell with a loud roar like an avalanche. Zhuoxian had long noticed that something was wrong and hid far away. Even so, he was still forced into a sorry state by the surging and wild power. For a moment, he was shocked. Perhaps this was the true power of a divine transformation stage Perfected Lord? They could seize the power of heaven and earth, break the mysteries of creation, and turn into gods with divine power that could destroy heaven and earth. Snow fell and the heavens and earth moaned. After a while, when the fierce snowstorm gradually calmed down, the snowstorm that had been wreaking havoc in the air had disappeared at some point. The 2 divine transformation stage perfected monarchs had already landed on the snowy ground from midair. However, the snowy ground was already riddled with holes and was uneven. There were deep pits and big holes everywhere. Only the two of them stood facing each other more than 20 feet away from each other. They did not seem to be in a good condition. Perfected Lord Tianlan's sleeves were torn in several places. His face was also a little pale and some of his wounds were bleeding. Hakushin Jinkuin's condition was worse. Blood flowed from the corner of his mouth and turned black. The two of them stood facing each other. After a while, Hakushin Jinkuin suddenly said, "You're indeed more talented than me. We're 20 years apart in age, but you've actually caught up to me in terms of cultivation." Unexpectedly, Perfected Lord Tianlan did not mean to be modest. He just nodded and said, "You're right." Hakushin Jinkuin sneered. He took a deep breath and wiped the black blood from the corner of his mouth. He said coldly, "Although your cultivation is high and you plotted against me with poison, I'm naturally not your match if we were outside. But you insisted on fighting on my winter peak. You can't blame me for borrowing the power of Snow Wind Spirit Mountain. So in the end, you're still the loser." Tianlan frowned and seemed to think about it seriously. Then he nodded and said, "You're also right about this." Hakushin Jinkuin's face turned cold. He did not seem to be happy or excited at all. On the contrary, his pupils contracted and a trace of fear and worry flashed across his eyes. At their level of deification, their mastery of the spiritual power of heaven and earth, Tao Dharma and divine sense had long been meticulous and exquisite, and their judgment of the situation was rarely wrong. However, even though Tianlan admitted that in the end, Hakushin Jinkuin, who borrowed the spiritual power of the cave mansion on Spirited Mountain, would be more advantageous, Tianlan himself did not have the slightest intention to retreat. He was even smiling there with calmness, as if he had nothing to fear. At that moment, Hakushin Jinkuin's mind was like electricity. He almost subconsciously wondered if there was someone else besides Zhuo Xian who had betrayed him and arranged some extremely sinister means for him. But very soon, he was shocked to find that his mind was a little chaotic at that moment. He had clearly gained the upper hand with the power of the cave mansion on Spirited Mountain, but why was his mind restless? What was the answer to this question? Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at him and suddenly said, "Senior brother, after Master's death, the two of us have been fighting openly and secretly for decades. Until today, I suddenly realized that you are actually old." Hakushin Jinkuin sneered and did not speak. Instead, he took a deep breath. The endless wind and snow once again gathered around him, and the powerful snowstorm seemed to show a little pattern again. No matter how glib Tianlan was, as long as he was on this winter peak, with the help of the spiritual power of heaven and earth mountains, he would never lose. Then why did he have to talk nonsense? Tianlan shook his head slightly and looked at Hakushin Jinkuin with a trace of pity in his eyes. It was a kind of condescending manner, a special look of a victor to a loser. In Hakushin Jinkuin's life, no one had ever dared to look at him like this. Except now. Hakushin Jinkuin sneered. He raised his hand and the snowstorm surged again. However, at this moment, his eyes suddenly froze and he suddenly looked up. He looked past Perfected Lord Tianlan's figure and looked at the mist behind him. The thick mist had unknowingly spread to the entire winter peak. At this moment, the mist also seemed to surge rapidly. A huge shadow that was comparable to the entire winter peak slowly appeared behind Perfected Lord Tianlan's composed figure. There was a sudden clap of thunder in the sky. Lightning tore the sky apart. Under the light, a terrifying black claw that was even twice the size of Perfected Lord Tianlan's body reached out from the thick mist. With a boom, it grabbed the land of the mountain. The wind and snow in the world were filled with desolation. Then the entire sky suddenly darkened. Chapter 233. The silhouette in the thick fog looked as big as a mountain. As it swayed, streams of black gas soared into the sky. Following that, the huge black claw with protruding joints suddenly grabbed onto the ground of the cliff of Winter Peak. The sharp and terrifying claws instantly pierced through the incomparably hard rocks, firmly grabbing onto it without letting go. After a moment, under the gaze of everyone on Winter Peak, that huge black claw suddenly contracted, as if it had used all its strength. Its bones and muscles bulged, and then an even bigger shadow rose from the bottom of Winter Peak. The dense fog tumbled like boiling water. It seemed to be extremely agitated, or perhaps it was filled with fear. In this dark night, a huge head could be vaguely seen, slowly approaching from the dense fog. There was a deep and thunderous breathing sound, even suppressing the sound of the snowstorm. Two huge eyes gradually appeared in the dense fog. There seemed to be a flame burning fiercely within it, and that flame was shockingly as deep as ink. Dark flames. Boundless dense fog was emitted from the ground. It had already completely surrounded the four odd peaks between the clouds and the sky, tightly wrapping around the most important forbidden area of the Kunlun party. In this pitch-black night, looking from afar, there was actually not the slightest hint of abnormality. Only at a certain moment in the midst of the violent storm, lightning, and thunder, when the lightning that suddenly tore apart the night sky and landed on this dense fog, could some shadows be seen. However, for some unknown reason, there should have been an earth-shattering battle in the dense fog, but at this moment, not the slightest movement could be heard from within the fog. Not a single trace. The place beyond the clouds in the sky was still submerged by the storm. The heavy rain was still falling, and the cold wind was still blowing, covering the entire Kunlun mountain range in the darkness of the night. No one knew when this night would be over. In the side hall behind the Jianghu Hall of Heavenly Kun Peak, almost all the enlightened Yuanying who came to this place had already arrived. In the middle of the hall, there were two main chairs and two large rosewood chairs, 10 on the left and 9 on the right, were arranged in a straight line. Today, the Kunlun party was the top cultivation sect in the divine central continent. In addition to the two perfected lords of soul formation who commanded the masses, there were 19 top Yuanying perfected masters in the sect. Among them, there were 15 in Kuanji and 4 in Tieji, led by Masato Kihara. But recently, Dongfang Tao had just broken through and became the 20th Yuanying Jinren of the Kunlun party, so there was an additional red sandalwood chair in this side hall. At this moment, there were already many people sitting on the chairs. After Dongfang Tao arrived, he very consciously sat in the last seat according to seniority. From his point of view, he saw perfected idol month sitting upright and still on the main seat in front of him, looking dignified. Slightly behind him was another large chair, which was still empty at the moment. As everyone knew, that seat belonged to Hakushin Jinkun. 2 rows of perfected Yuanying great perfected masters were seated below him. If this lineup was casually seen by others, it would be truly frightening. This was the embodiment of the powerful strength of the current Kunlun party and the foundation of the Kunlun sect. To the left of Taoist Master Idol Moon sat Taoist Master Thousand Lanterns. Below him were Taoist Master Pearl, Taoist Master Guangyang, and the others. To the right of Taoist Master Idol Moon, the first seat was empty. Further down, Dongfang Tao could also see that several Yuanying perfected masters who were close to perfected idol month, including several Yuanying perfected masters who had appeared in the Jianghu Hall during the day earlier, were also sitting there. When they sensed Dongfang Tao's gaze on them, they also smiled and nodded at him. From the looks of it, the atmosphere in the hall seemed to be rather relaxed. Dongfang Tao thought indifferently. Occasionally, when his gaze swept past the area in front of him, he would notice some strange details. Perfected idol month's expression was dignified and serious, but his eyes would glance at the nearest empty seat every now and then. There was a faint trace of anxiety in the depths of his eyes. Perfected Thousand Lanterns and the others on the opposite side of the empty seat remained silent. Their faces were calm and indifferent, but they would occasionally reveal a trace of a smile with a hint of coldness and mockery. It was Dongfang Tao's first time coming to this side hall. After a moment of silence, he lowered his voice and quietly asked a perfected Yuanying perfected master who was sitting next to him. After receiving the answer, he nodded and thanked him. When he raised his head again to look at the empty seat, his gaze was somewhat different. That empty seat originally belonged to Heavenly Soldier Hall's Dukan Jinren. It was already so late. Why was it that Dukan Jinren, the sect leader's most hardcore, most resolute, and at the same time most unlikely partner to be absent, had still not come here? Where did he go? Other than Dukan Jinren, there were several other empty chairs in this hall. However, most of the reasons were known to everyone. For example, there was a perfected Yuanying perfected master from Tiezhi who was in closed-door training in order to extend his lifespan. If he failed, he would probably die of old age. There were also some who were in closed-door training in order to practice some kind of extremely difficult Dao technique. This kind of closed-door training could not be interrupted, so they did not come here. But basically, those who could come here and those who should have come here were almost all here. Right now, in this side hall, there were only 2 people who should have come but had not yet. One was Dukan Jinren, and the other was even more influential. It was the owner of the chair next to Perfected Idol Month, Hakushin Jinkuan. These 2 were undoubtedly Perfected Idol Month's strongest supporters in the Kunlun party, especially his teacher, Hakushin Jinkuan, who was an important person. The impact of these 2's absence was obvious. Even just by looking at them, it made people feel that Perfected Idol Month's side had suddenly become much emptier, giving off a strange feeling of weakness. Perfected Idol Month was indifferent to this, as if he did not feel anything. He was still sitting quietly, as if his patience at this moment was endless, ready to wait for these 2 people to come. Perfected Idol Month was the sect master. If he showed that he was willing to continue waiting, most people would not say anything against it. Although the identity of a Taoist master of Yuanying stage is precious, each of their time is extremely precious, but tonight is obviously a different night, and to be able to cultivate to this point, how can there be a stupid idiot? Although there is no sign tonight, the atmosphere has been a bit different from previous years. Perfected Qiandang's faction was silent and did not move, while those from Perfected Idol Month's faction began to frown one after another, their faces revealing a hint of worry. There was also a portion of Perfected Yuanying who was usually neutral, who also felt that something was wrong. After observing the situation for a while, they all looked at their noses at their hearts, and their mouths were shut. I don't care if it's wind or rain, I'll just sit and watch. Dongfang Tao was a newcomer who had just arrived at this realm. In the past, he had actually more or less heard of some undercurrents surging in the sect and stories of open and secret strife. However, he was not a direct descendant of the lineage of ancestor Tianhong, so his position in the Kunlun sect had always been somewhat marginalized. It was precisely because of this that Dongfang Tao showed the attitude of relying on Perfected Idol Month on this day, and received Perfected Idol Month's praise and acceptance. No matter what, because Perfected Yuanying was a powerful and precious battle force, it was necessary to win over them. However, after arriving at this side hall, Dongfang Tao suddenly realized that his choice did not seem to be as stable as Mount Tai as he had originally thought. The hostility in this sect towards Perfected Idol Month's faction was much stronger than he had expected. Dongfang Tao was a little puzzled about this, because his many years of experience had long since explained one problem: as long as Hakushin Jinkuan was around, Perfected Idol Month's position was unshakable, and Perfected Idol Month's faction's power was unshakable. But why did those people seem to be a little aggressive? Why did they dare to do this? Why did they seem not too afraid? As Dongfang Tao was pondering, a voice suddenly sounded in the hall that had been silent for a long time. It was Perfected Qiandang, who was sitting on the left side of the main seat, slowly standing up. His gaze was calm as he looked around at the crowd. In that instant, Dongfang Tao's heart suddenly trembled, as if he had sensed something, and he actually became a little nervous. Perfected Idol Month, who was sitting on the main seat, also suddenly raised her head. Her gaze was cold, and a sharp light seemed to shoot out from her eyes as she stared at Perfected Qiandang. However, Perfected Qiandang didn't seem to notice this. He didn't even carefully look at Perfected Idol Month. Instead, his gaze swept across the faces of all the Yuanying spiritual masters present. After a moment, he suddenly smiled and said, "It's getting late. It's already past the time for our little meeting, right?" At that moment, the entire hall was silent. It was unknown how many nascent soul-perfected masters were sitting still, their faces expressionless. Dongfang Tao, however, took a deep breath, as if he was preparing himself to welcome the sudden storm. No one spoke, and no one responded to Perfected Qiandang. The atmosphere in the hall was subtle and strange. However, perfected Qian Deng didn't seem to mind at all. After looking around, he smiled and continued, "Therefore, I feel that we should begin now. Everyone here is a Yuanying spiritual master, and everyone's time is precious. Am I right, senior brother sect master?" His last sentence was said as he turned his head to look at perfected idol month. At that moment, the atmosphere in the hall was so cold and quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Perfected idol month slowly stood up and stared at perfected Qian Deng. After a moment, she said in a deep voice, "There are still a few who haven't arrived yet. It won't be too late to wait." Perfected Qian Deng shook his head and said, "Senior brother sect master, forgive me for speaking bluntly. We've waited for too long. Those who haven't arrived yet won't come. There's no need to waste any more time." A series of gasps could be vaguely heard from the surrounding nascent souls. All of them looked over with complicated expressions. Perfected idol month narrowed her eyes and looked coldly at perfected Qian Deng. She said in a cold voice, "Junior brother Qian Deng, do you mean that you don't even want to wait for my master, Hakushin Jinkuen?" As soon as these words came out, the surrounding people's breathing seemed to stop. Everyone's gaze fell on perfected Qian Deng. Chapter 234. The heavy rain did not stop. The dense forest was pitch black. One could not even see one's fingers if one stretched out one's hand. Right now, even the dense foliage above their heads could not block the seemingly endless water flow. Everywhere, like a broken dam, large waves of water flowed down from the top of the trees. The two figures hidden in the darkness, after the initial shock, quickly quietened down. This forest was so dark that they could not even see each other's faces clearly, also could not see the expression on the person beside them. After an unknown period of time, Lu Chen lowered his voice and said, "The pattern on the back of the tree bark, was it drawn by you?" White Lotus's body shook slightly, seemed surprised again, after a moment of hesitation, said, "No." This time it was Lu Chen who was stunned, and before he could continue to question, White Lotus had already said, "That pattern was not drawn by you." Lu Chen was speechless, looked up at the blurry and petite figure in front of him. At this moment, he felt that he could not see White Lotus's face clearly. Everything about this young girl seemed to be more and more mysterious and strange. "It was also not me." Lu Chen quickly denied, took a deep breath and said, "Then why are you here?" White Lotus instead asked, "I also wanted to ask you this question. That pattern is obviously an extremely rare secret pattern in the evil sect. Outsiders are not even able to know about it. How did you know about it, and why are you here?" Lu Chen did not speak. White Lotus also very quickly quietened down. Both of their bodies hibernating in the darkness, suddenly moved back a little at the same time, distancing themselves from each other. Lu Chen turned his head, glanced at the big tree in the forest. After a moment of silent contemplation, he made a decision in his heart. Even though White Lotus looked sincere, even though she was only a child, but this girl's words could not be trusted. To coincidentally come here at this night, it was impossible to say that it had nothing to do with the evil sect. This girl must have some great secret on her. Just when he had made up his mind and prepared to move, suddenly his body shook violently, almost fell down, and then in that darkness, black flames suddenly ignited in his eyes. A cold, murderous intent uncontrollably rose up. White Lotus almost instantly sensed this biting, cold, murderous intent. With a cold snort, took 2 steps back, facing Lu Chen with full vigilance. But Lu Chen did not make a move. Instead, with a trace of bewilderment, turned his head, looked into the depths of the darkness. That was the depths of Kunlun Mountain, the legendary place where the sky and clouds were. Just now, he suddenly felt an extremely familiar aura coming from that direction, directly resonating with the black fire hidden in the deepest part of his body, causing the black fire in his body to instantly rise, almost unable to be suppressed. The black flames swayed in the distance in the dark forest, as if there was an extremely strong but from the same source, attracting this black flames. Between the sky and clouds, the winter peak was shrouded in fog. An incomparably powerful aura seeped out of the thick fog. A figure as huge as a mountain was faintly discernible in the fog. Gradually, a huge head approached the cliff on the winter peak. Its true appearance was gradually revealed from the dense fog. It was a huge dragon head, completely black, with long and tough dragon whiskers swaying in the wind, like two long black whips. Snow-white fangs faintly appeared in the dragon's mouth, emitting a cold glint. The most terrifying thing was that the pair of huge dragon eyes didn't have pupils. Instead, they were burning with a strange black flame. It looked like a demon that had suddenly leaped out from the netherworld. It slowly rose in front of the winter peak and appeared in front of everyone on the winter peak in a horrifying manner. The huge and frightening dragon eyes looked down from above. The place where it appeared was right behind True Lord Tianlan, and at that moment, the dragon's head could even be said to be right above True Lord Tianlan's head. As long as it lowered its head slightly, it could swallow True Lord Tianlan, who looked extremely small in comparison, in one gulp. However, True Lord Tianlan did not seem to be on guard at all. He still stood there calmly, his wide sleeves fluttering in the wind. At this moment, both he and the unimaginably terrifying dragon that had suddenly appeared were looking at the person on the snow-covered ground in front of them, Hakushin Jinkuan. Hakushin Jinkuan's expression suddenly changed the moment the black figure appeared. His usually calm face showed a rare expression of inconceivable astonishment. Then, all kinds of expressions intertwined on his face, complicated and incomprehensible. Even his body faintly trembled. It was not fear, but rage. He withdrew his gaze from the terrifying black dragon and stared at Tianlan. He gritted his teeth and said in a hoarse voice, How did you do it? How dare you do this? True Lord Tianlan's expression did not change, and he looked calm as if he had always had a clear conscience. He turned a deaf ear to Hakushin Jinkuan's questions. The black dragon's head above his head swayed slightly, and a dull sound that sounded like it was tearing through the air sounded. It was as if the dragon's power was so powerful that even the slightest movement would cause a chain reaction. It was truly unimaginable how powerful the black dragon would be if it were to completely rage and attack. Upon seeing that Tianlan did not reply, Hakushin Jinkuan seemed to become even more furious. However, just as he was about to flare up again, something even stranger happened. The black dragon's head, which was high up in the sky, suddenly stretched forward. The black flames in the dragon's eyes burned as if they were reflecting by Chen's figure. Immediately after, the dragon's mouth opened, and a deep, thunderous voice suddenly came from the snowstorm. It was the black dragon speaking in human language. He's smarter than you. Hakushin Jinkuan suddenly raised his head and looked at the black dragon with a pale face. Then he laughed bitterly and said to True Lord Tianlan, You're audacious, reckless, and rebellious. You've gone far beyond what Master and I warned you about back then. Now that things have come to this, you're actually arrogant enough to let this monster out. Aren't you afraid of being punished by the heavens? When he said the last few words, Hakushin Jinkuan's voice was like thunder. Every word rumbled as if he wanted to shout angrily to wake up True Lord Tianlan in his eyes. However, Tianlan frowned slightly and said calmly, This bewildering fog formation has already surrounded the sky. No matter how loudly you shout, it won't be heard. Hakushin Jinkuan's expression was solemn. Suddenly, his expression turned cold as he said, I've lived for a long time and have enjoyed all kinds of honor and glory. It's nothing even if I die here today. But I just want to ask you one thing, junior brother. Why are you acting so recklessly without any regard for anything else? He shook his head in pain and pointed at his chest. Could it be that you've done so many things just to fight with me and kill me? True Lord Tianlan's expression was as calm as water. No changes could be seen in his heart. Even when Hakushin Jinkuan questioned him sternly, he did not reveal any expression of guilt, regret, or fear. He just stood there calmly and finally smiled. Senior brother, you're old. You won't understand me, he said indifferently. No one in this world will understand what I want to do. I don't expect you to understand me either. In life, a good man should do what he wants. even if the sky falls and the earth shatters, he should still look down on everyone and do as he pleases. Tianlong didn't say these words out loud, but Bai Chen could tell from his expression and eyes that he was serious. They had been brothers for so many years. No one in this world would understand this junior brother better than him. If there was someone, it would probably be their master, ancestor Tianhong, who had already passed away. Hakushin Jinkuan did not say anything else. After taking a deep breath, the anger on his face quickly dissipated. Wind and snow appeared behind him and gradually condensed into a white snowstorm. The pride and power of a divine transformation stage true lord would never end so easily. The withered old man straightened his back and looked coldly at the burly bald man in front of him, as well as the even more terrifying black dragon. He suddenly sneered and said proudly, "Do you think that releasing the black dragon and plotting against me will make me bow down to you?" The black fire in the black dragon's huge eyes flickered and seemed to burn brightly. However, true Lord Tianlong, who was below the dragon's head, stared at Hakushin Jinkuan for a moment and suddenly shook his head. "Senior brother, you're afraid." Hakushin Jinkuan was furious and shouted, "Nonsense! I have the protection of the mountain spirit on this winter peak today. Although that evildoer is ferocious, he has been suppressed for thousands of years. How can he have any combat power or divine ability? Come, let's fight to the death. It's still unknown who will emerge victorious." True Lord Tianlong smiled and slowly waved one of his arms. The thick fog floating behind him suddenly retreated and even the huge dragon's head looked down at him. An incomparably tyrannical power slowly emanated from his body. It was pure yang and as warm as the sun. At first, there was a faint golden light. Then, the light grew brighter and brighter like the rising sun with thousands of golden rays. The endless wind and snow melted and retreated in front of this golden light. He was like a god in the golden light, and a blazing yang qi gushed out, making it hard for people to look at him directly. Hakushin Jinkuan's expression changed drastically. His pupils constricted and he said bitterly, "Positive yang art. You've actually mastered it?" In the golden light, a scorching yang qi rose, forming a sharp contrast with the icy wind and snow on Hakushin Jinkuan's side. Within the light, true Lord Tianlan's deep voice sounded indifferently. "Master has long said that I'm much more talented than you in terms of cultivation." Right after he said that, the golden light shone brightly and pounced towards Hakushin Jinkuan. Hakushin Jinkuan roared furiously and the wind and snow howled as well. The two perfected lords finally began their final battle in the deep fog of the night. Chapter 235. The light of the rising sun shone brightly. Everywhere it passed, not only did the ice and snow melt, even the rocks and soil under the white snow cracked. A brilliant aura seemed to carry a trace of a domineering aura that was above all things as it rushed over unstoppably. Looking at this golden pillar of light, Hakushin Jinkuan's expression was unusually grim. He took a step back and the surrounding snow and wind immediately stirred up, turning into a blizzard to meet it. The blazing sun and the blizzard, one hot and one cold, one bright and one dark, one yang and one yin, like the two extremes of heaven and earth, like water and fire, collided in an instant. At the very beginning, the two completely different rays of light were locked in a stalemate in midair, constantly melting, dissolving, and constantly surging up. The surrounding space began to distort intensely, and even strange rainbow-colored lights began to appear in the scorching sun, wind, and snow, as well as ear-piercing screeches. After a while, the blizzard began to recede and the blazing sun gradually became more dazzling, pressing forward step by step. Black flames flickered in the eyes of the black dragon in the sky, but it was impossible to tell what it was feeling. Instead, Zhuxian, who had been hiding in a corner after being clearly frightened by the appearance of the black dragon, came to his senses at this moment and revealed a hint of joy on his face. Hakushin Jinkuan's expression changed slightly. Then, with a soft cry, he took a few steps back and leaned his back against an ice wall. In an instant, there was a sudden ka-ka-ka-ka sound and the ice on the mountain wall cracked and fell. White smoke surged out of the mountain rock and seeped into Hakushin Jinkuin's body. As the white smoke entered his body, Hakushin Jinkuin's eyes shone brightly. The blizzard howled wildly and actually rolled back, pushing back the previously unstoppable radiance of the rising sun. Streaks of ice and snow condensed on the ground and in the air, as if the temperature in the air had instantly dropped to an extremely low point. Even the snowflakes had turned into ice cubes, and the blizzard that filled the sky was turning into hail. The white frost was unstoppable, suppressing the scorching light along the way and approaching Perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression was indifferent, as if he was not too surprised or angry by the instant reversal of the situation. He merely stretched out his other hand and pressed it in front of him, drawing a circle with his other hand. Strong pure yang qi overflowed from his palm and directly formed a fire shield in front of him. The white frost pressed forward but was once again blocked in front of the fire shield and could not advance any further. Even so, Hakushin Jinkuin had the upper hand. He had been paying attention to the huge black dragon all this while. However, the black dragon did not move at all from the beginning to the end. Regardless of whether Tianlan had the upper hand or reversed the situation and fell into a disadvantageous position, the black dragon had no intention of attacking. In the Kunlun sect, only Bai Chen and Tianlan knew the secret of the underground palace under the forbidden area. Apart from Tianlan, there was practically no one who knew more about this terrifying monster than Perfected Lord Bai Chen. Apart from Tianlan, almost no one knew more about this terrifying monster than Hakushin Jinkuin. He knew that this monster should not have woken up. It should have been trapped in that dark place, never to rise again. It had been sealed in the darkness for 5,000 years. Would it really be as terrifying as it was back then when it suddenly woke up? At least for now, it seemed that this black dragon was just an empty shell that only had the looks of it. Hakushin Jinkuin's spirits were lifted. If that was really the case, the situation that he originally thought was certain defeat and death today actually had a chance to turn around. Although junior brother Tianlan was indeed extremely powerful, attacking on this winter peak was his biggest mistake. He could even force the demonic dragon back into the underground palace after killing Tianlan. As these thoughts raced through his mind, Hakushin Jinkuin had already thought of many things. However, although Perfected Lord Tianlan was temporarily at a disadvantage, he relied on the fire shield in front of him to defend himself. No matter how Hakushin Jinkuin urged his Taoist skills and magic powers, the frost and snow that could freeze ordinary people to death countless times still could not break through the fire shield's defense and could not advance any further. The Zhengyang tactic was indeed the world's best magical Taoist skill. It was upright and pure, with a faint aura of the way of the king. It became stronger the stronger it was, and its defense was incomparably tight. However, such an extraordinary magical skill was obtained by junior brother Tianlan. Hakushin Jinkuin seemed to suddenly think of something. His expression turned ugly. He stared at Perfected Lord Tianlan with a murderous look in his eyes. Suddenly, he let out a long roar and flew into the air. With a shake of his arms, it was as if infinite spiritual power suddenly jumped on the entire winter peak, causing a deafening roar. Countless white smoke floated out from the tall winter peak, wisps and wisps, swam towards Hakushin Jinkuin in the air. Following the gathering of the white smoke, the entire winter peak seemed to have come alive. It seemed to have become one with the skinny Hakushin Jinkuin in the air, breathing together, vibrating together. Right now, the mountain was the man was the mountain. Hakushin Jinkuin was like the incarnation of the mountain god, looking down at Tianlan. Suddenly he laughed loudly, raised his hand and chopped down. At that moment, there seemed to be an illusion in the night sky. The winter peak turned into an incomparably huge giant, slapped down with his palm, wanting to crush the ant under his palm. But Perfected Lord Tianlan still did not have much expression on his face. He was still desperately supporting the fire shield, resisting little by little Hakushin Jinkuin's terrifying and crazy attack. Just when the outcome was about to be decided, suddenly, in the depths of the mist, a huge and terrifying shadow appeared. With an indescribable speed, it flew over. It was a huge black claw. It was the black dragon's second claw. The black dragon's claw tore through the endless wind and snow, piercing straight into the snowstorm like the palm of a giant. Before anyone could react, there was a muffled bang. With a muffled grunt, Hakushin Jinkuin was sent flying by the claw. He somersaulted a few times in the air, then crashed heavily into the snow with a poof. Half of his body even pierced into the snow. At the same time, the peerlessly powerful black dragon that had just launched a successful sneak attack slowly retracted its claw. Then, its whiskers undulated as it said calmly, "I heard that you thought I wasn't powerful just now?" The black dragon sneered and even flicked its huge claw. Then, it lowered its head and said to perfected Lord Tunlun, "How was it?" Because Hakushin Jinkuin had been sent flying, perfected Lord Tunlun, who had just been suppressed by the mountain range's spirit chi, finally heaved a sigh of relief. Just then, he heard the black dragon's question. Perfected Lord Tunlun glanced at the black dragon and sneered. "Just so. Black flames flashed in the black dragon's eyes, but it did not say anything, nor did it do anything harmful to perfected Lord Tianlon. Instead, it slowly raised its head and said, "Kun Yuanzi and Tai Luo are not good people. They are unwilling to tell their descendants anything. They probably forgot to tell you that the one in the underground palace is a petty dragon." Perfected Lord Tianlon chuckled. "I understand now." The black flames in the black dragon's eyes flickered. It turned its head and looked in Hakushin Jinkuin's direction again. By now, Hakushin Jinkuin had somewhat regained consciousness and slowly stood up from the snow. However, after receiving that heavy blow, Hakushin Jinkuin's condition was terrible. Not only was his clothes in disarray, blood could be seen everywhere from his wounds and between his nose and mouth. He looked extremely wretched. However, before he could regain his composure, a whistling sound suddenly rang out from the sky and a huge black claw smashed down. On the ground in front of him, a dazzling, scorching radiance once again roused itself. This time, it was even more intense than before as it struck down towards him. Tianlan and the black dragon had no intention of giving Hakushin Jinkuin any chance to catch his breath. Seeing that the soul-chasing killing move was right in front of him, Hakushin Jinkuin suddenly roared angrily. His clothes instantly tore apart and all the ice and snow on his hands, feet and body rose into the air, blocking the two monsters' powerful strength. However, the enemy he was facing was too powerful. Or rather, it could be said that not only were they powerful, they were also exceptionally cunning, decisive and determined. The black dragon's giant claws kept smashing at the snowstorm. Every time its claws landed, a large piece of snow and ice would be shaken away. On the other side, Lord Tianlan was silently activating the positive yang tactic with all his might. With a terrifying power that could melt hard iron, he corroded the snowstorm one after another. Hakushin Jinkuin tried his best to resist, but as time went on, it was no longer a long-term solution. Seeing that he was being pressured by the two terrifying forces and had to absorb the terrifying amount of white smoke, he began to tremble at some point in time. After that, he suddenly heard a loud bang. Bai Chen's body suddenly flew backward, and she slammed heavily into the stone wall the next moment. Immediately, ice shards danced in the air, and shattered snowflakes fell from the sky with a hint of desolation. The outcome had been decided. Hakushin Jinkuin was bleeding from his 7 orifices. He was severely injured, but even so, his will seemed to be as firm as steel. He slowly stood up. He opened his blood-stained eyes, panting and laughing bitterly. Suddenly, a hint of madness flashed across his face. With a backhand slap, he directly pounced on the mountain wall with his flesh and blood. The white smoke frantically surged into his body, but Hakushin Jinkuin did not stand up again. He only looked up at the sky and laughed maniacally. He roared, "You're delusional enough to want my immortal cave abode? Dream on." Boom. A strange sound came from the winter peak. Perfected Lord Talon suddenly raised his head and glanced at the peak of the mountain. His expression instantly became abnormally ugly. The huge mountain was no longer affected by the snowstorm, but everything on the mountain seemed to have shattered at this moment. Rocks of various sizes kept falling from the mountain. However, the rumbling thunder did not come from the clouds in the sky. Instead, it came from within the winter peak. Hakushin Jinkuin laughed maniacally. "You're still coveting my treasures? Dream on, junior brother. What I will give you is only a collapsed ruin." He roared furiously. All of a sudden, Bai Chen's entire body swelled up and kept expanding. When he reached a certain size, his flesh and blood suddenly exploded, turning into countless splatters of blood. At the same time, the entire winter peak shook violently. Immediately after, a large amount of dust rose into the sky. More and more rocks fell from the mountain. The ground began to crack, and the entire mountain began to collapse. One of the peerless peaks in the sky actually collapsed and fell to the ground today. Chapter 236. A cry that seemed to have come from ancient times reverberated between the heavens and the earth, causing all living creatures to tremble. It was a huge roar that burst forth from the depths of the huge winter peak when it collapsed. At the same time, countless strong rays of light shot out from the mountain, rushing towards the boundless world of darkness in all directions. It was a spiritual light that was condensed from pure and powerful spiritual power. It pierced through all obstacles. At this moment, even the layers of thick fog could not stop the powerful force that erupted at the final moment of the Spirit Mountain's destruction. For a moment, the light was so dazzling that it reached the vault of heaven, illuminating half of the night sky. Large chunks of boulders and rock strata were constantly breaking and collapsing. The entire winter peak was slowly falling, followed by a terrifying storm of dust. The towering Kunlun mountain range, which stretched for thousands of miles, seemed to be trembling non-stop at this moment. The earth also seemed to be wailing. After a moment, the collapse of the winter peak became faster and faster. The smoke and dust grew larger and higher. Just as the floating mountain was about to be completely submerged by the smoke and dust, dozens of dazzling spiritual lights suddenly converged into a scorching, dazzling, and huge pillar of light that flickered and shot straight into the sky. In an instant, the wind blew away the clouds, and the sky changed color. All the dark clouds retreated in front of this pillar of light. Countless gusts of wind and clouds turned into a huge whirlpool that spun rapidly in the air. Darkness and light intertwined, flashing with silver lightning that tore apart the night sky. Then, accompanied by an earth-shattering noise, a wave of light surged in all directions like a raging wave. All the dark clouds were scattered, and the wind and rain suddenly stopped. In the deep and gloomy night, in this originally stormy night, the wind and rain suddenly stopped. Then, a rare yet strangely enchanting scene appeared in the middle of the night. A bright moonlight sprinkled down from the vault of heaven. In the pitch-black night sky, a full moon hung above the 9 heavens. It was full and perfect, dazzling, cold, and peerless, and radiated light in all directions. It was as if everything in this world had lost its color. On the night of the full moon, this full moon finally appeared above the vault of heaven. As soon as the full moon appeared, the dense fog seemed to be suddenly stimulated. It suddenly shrank and began to shrink back into the ground. Perfected Lord Tianlon, who had already flown into the air, stood in the void with his hands behind his back. A strong gust of wind blew past him, causing his loose robes to flutter loudly. He looked like an immortal. Beneath his feet was the ruins of the winter peak amidst a sea of dust. The majestic peak seemed to have turned into the tomb of a deity transformation stage perfected cultivator, sacrificing his body to protect him. Tianlon was not angry about this. His expression was unexpectedly calm as he silently stared at the cold moon in the sky. It was said that when one was at the peak, they would feel lonely and cold. Nobody knew how perfected Lord Tianlon felt at that moment. The huge black dragon in the dense fog had retreated and disappeared at some point. It seemed that it did not like such a strong and bright moonlight. Its huge body had also disappeared into the darkness without a sound. Zhuxian, who was a little below perfected Lord Tianlon, also flew into the air. He looked at the destroyed winter peak with a complicated expression. Finally, he seemed to sigh. Then, with a respectful expression, he lowered his head slightly towards perfected Lord Tenlon and waited patiently. Just like how he had been patient when he was under perfected Lord Bai Chen all these years, he had shown sufficient sincerity and submission. In fact, he was even more patient than before. Because the situation was no longer the same as before. In Kunlun, there was no other deity transformation stage perfected cultivator who could compete with the one in front of him. That night, almost every place in Kunlun was shocked by this sudden scene. Everyone, whether they were insiders or not, was shaken to the core. When the earth began to shake, everyone was frightened. When the loud noise resounded through the heavens and earth, everyone felt that they were in danger. In the end, when the wind and rain suddenly stopped and the moonlight shone down, everyone was dumbfounded. In the Xingyang Hall of Mount Tiankuan, the 10 or so Yuanying perfected cultivators who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world were all standing in front of the windows and doorways with different emotions. They looked at the terrifying scene of the winter peak falling after the dense fog in the distance dispersed. No one said anything, or perhaps no one knew what to say or what to say. Since ancient times, it seemed that something that would never change had been destroyed in front of their eyes. Therefore, when the cold moonlight shone on them again and shone into the side hall, every Yuanying perfected cultivator seemed to feel a chill. Perfected Master Idol Month was dumbfounded. His face was filled with astonishment and horror. His usual calmness had completely vanished at this moment. Such an earth-shattering event was right in front of them. The mountain peak that symbolized the supreme power of Kunlun had suddenly collapsed in front of them. Who could remain calm? Suddenly, perfected Master Idol Month came to his senses. He immediately stood up and roared, "Quick! Let's go to the winter peak to save the people." There was a commotion in the hall. For a moment, nearly half of the nascent soul-perfected masters took a step forward. But at this moment, suddenly, there was a slightly cold, abnormally calm and even somewhat grim voice that reverberated in the side hall. "Wait!" Everyone was shocked. They turned around and saw that the person who spoke was perfected Master Qian Deng, who was seated below perfected Master Idol Month. In the midst of the chaos, this great perfected master, who held a high position in the Kunlun party, had unexpectedly returned to his seat. He sat steadily, calmly, as if he was an old tree that had taken root, not moving an inch. There was not the slightest trace of shock on his face at this moment. His face was calm as he slowly opened his mouth and said, "Senior brothers and junior brothers, I think we should start this small meeting. As for those who haven't arrived yet, there's no need to wait any longer." As soon as these words came out, the crowd suddenly burst into an uproar. Even though each and every one of the Yuanying perfected masters were well-mannered, their faces changed at this moment. They looked at perfected Master Qian Deng in horror. "You!" Perfected Master Idol Month was filled with anger. He pointed at perfected Master Qian Deng and was so angry that he couldn't speak for a moment. Even his fingers seemed to be trembling. At this time, someone beside him also came back to his senses and immediately rebuked perfected Master Qian Deng for not seeing the big picture. Perfected Master Qian Deng didn't defend himself. He waited for the surrounding people to quiet down a little before he calmly said, "Marshal Uncle Tenlun will be here in a while. When that time comes, it's up to you to decide what to do and what to do next." After saying this, he closed his eyes and no longer spoke. The surrounding hall instantly fell into a deathly silence. Perfected Master Idol Month's face was ashen. His body slightly trembled and a trace of despair finally appeared in his eyes. The cold moonlight sprinkled on the hall's floor, like frost and snow. The speed at which the weather changed was simply inconceivable on this night. A moment ago, it was still raining cats and dogs, and in the next moment, the clouds suddenly parted and the rain dispersed, revealing a bright moon hanging high in the sky. It truly caught one off guard. In the dense forest, from the darkness where one couldn't even see their own fingers in front of them to the sudden disappearance of the water flow and the sprinkling of moonlight, it only took a moment. In the moonlight, Lu Chen and White Lotus suddenly saw each other. They were both taken aback and took a step back. Lu Chen looked up and saw an unusually bright round moon hanging in the sky. He was extremely shocked, but what shocked him even more was that in the depths of Kunlun Mountain, the mysterious power that resonated with the black fire in his body had actually reached an unimaginable level of intensity. White Lotus suddenly cried out in alarm and took 2 steps back. Then she pointed at Lu Chen and said in surprise, You, what's wrong with your eyes? Why is there a black fire burning? Lu Chen was shocked. This black fire was his most meticulously guarded secret. It could be said that in this world, other than the mute black dog, almost no one had seen or knew about this black fire. At this moment, under the stimulation and attraction of that strange power, he actually couldn't control the power in his body for a moment. The black fire surged up and suddenly appeared in his eyes. Revealing the black fire in his eyes, such a strange appearance, looked like a ghost. Obviously, it was not a supernatural power that could be possessed by the Kunlun party. At that moment, thoughts turned in Lu Chen's mind. The murderous intent on his body fluctuated silently. But at this moment, White Lotus's expression changed slightly. Suddenly, her body shook and she looked into the distance. She saw the huge change that seemed like the sky was falling and the earth was splitting. She saw the scene of the winter peak falling and collapsing. She seemed to be stunned for a moment. Then, she let out a scream and shouted, "Teacher!" Before her voice died away, her whole body shot out like lightning and rushed in the direction of the collapsed winter peak. Her body was so fast that after a few turns in the forest, she was about to disappear from his line of sight. When Lu Chen saw her body move, his face darkened. He subconsciously took a step forward, as if he wanted to make a move. At that moment, a cold wind suddenly blew in the forest. Drops of moisture and water splashed everywhere. A cold light flashed in the eyes of White Lotus, who was in the middle of running, and she seemed to look in his direction. A faint light was faintly discernible in the palm of her hand. In Lu Chen's eyes, the black fire burned fiercely. The moment the two of them brushed past each other, they both seemed to hold their breaths and did not move. It was as if they were overflowing with killing intent, but in the end, they slowly suppressed it. In that inexplicable moment, the two of them separated in the blink of an eye. White Lotus flew away and did not look back. Lu Chen watched the young girl's back disappear into the darkness of the night. Then, he slowly turned around and looked at the earth-shattering change under the bright moonlight in the distance. His expression was complicated. After an unknown amount of time, he raised his head to look at the bright moon in the horizon. Suddenly, he turned around and walked outside. There was a low sigh from his mouth, as if a question of doubt was left in this dark forest. Why didn't you come? You're tuning in to the Han Li's Immortal Journey YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.